Hey there, thrill seekers! Are you ready to get crazy? Are you ready to get extreme? Are you ready to taste the real hardcore? We here at SCP Explained know that you love a little excitement in your life. You're the kind of stone-cold solid gold bad dude whose idea of a relaxing afternoon is a staring contest with SCP-173. And you're so tough you're gonna make the peanut blink first. You're the kind of person who'd punch SCP-682 and make him apologize for grazing your fist. You wouldn't even back down from the Scarlet King himself, making the Monarch of Ultimate Despair say, "That's pretty cool, man. Respect." But if you want a genuine thrill ride, something that'll really put hair on your chest, you need to get your butt on a truly hardcore roller coaster. What? Too chicken? Afraid of a little motion sickness or something? Or maybe you've been freaked out by some of the so-called horrifying accidents that happened on roller coasters, like the 1972 Big Dipper disaster, or the 1986 Fantasyland Mindbender catastrophe. Get real. When has a little death scared anyone at the SCP Foundation? And besides, nothing is more awesome than an extreme roller coaster. And believe us, any other roller coaster will feel like kiddie stuff compared to the absolute beast that we're gonna tell you about today. If you're a roller coaster novice, maybe you should try something like the Takabisha over in the Fuji-Q Highland theme park in Japan. This baby boasts a 121-degree drop, famous for making people fall out of their seats. Or maybe you want to try something like Yukon Striker over in Canada. This widowmaker of a coaster has floorless seats, a 360-degree flip, 4 inversions, and a 75-meter drop. That's a little too tame for your taste? If you're feeling really brave, you can hop on the King Ka over in the New Jersey Six Flags theme park. You'll get a super fast 90-degree climb, followed by a bone-stripping 139-meter drop, a 129-foot camel hump, and a 270-degree spiral. Ha! That'll give you a healthy dose of vitamin G-force. Why are we telling you all about this? Because compared to SCP-2183, all those coasters are like riding a tricycle with stabilizers in your mom's backyard. There's no coaster more powerful, more thrilling, and more adrenaline-pumping than SCP-2183. Let's take a look at some of the specs. You can find this bad boy in an undisclosed location somewhere in Idaho. This ride is so hardcore, the killjoys over at the SCP Foundation don't want you to ride it. But if the lamos over at the Foundation had their way, nobody would be having any fun. Am I right? Look at how they put the kibosh on the Carnival of Horrors, or as they call it, SCP-823. Anyone who wants to go on one of those rides will just have met the business end of a Foundation sniper rifle. And think about all the kids who've been deprived of the awesome childhood experience of Cragglewood Park, aka SCP-2571, because the Foundation party poopers decided to rain on everybody's parade. It's safe to say that if the Foundation wants to keep you away from it, you're gonna have a dope time with it. And the SCP-2183 roller coaster is no exception. They have the whole park blocked off and patrolled by at least 4 security guards at any given time. People who see this beast in action are given Class F amnestics, and they've spared no expense in suppressing anything about this coaster to end all coasters in the media. But trust us, getting a ride on this thing is totally more than worth getting on the SCP Foundation's bad side. That's right, this killer coaster has a max height of 37.2 meters and a max speed of almost 90 kilometers per hour. You can't drive that fast anywhere but the Autobahn over in Germany. Sure, it may technically be unfinished, but this bad boy still has a physical track length of 798.8 meters. You're probably wondering why we said physical there, right? That's because when it comes to SCP-2183, the real ride starts when the track comes to an end, baby. When the ride starts a-rolling, it blasts down the normal tracks like a bullet. But when the track ends and the carts fire off, they don't fall. No way. The carts keep speeding mid-air, continuing on the intended track from the roller coaster's initial badass blueprints. But that doesn't mean this ride does everything by the books. SCP-2183 is a ride that knows how to party. There's never any predicting the exact ride length, because every time the carts fire off the uncompleted section of track, they take a totally different path back to the start. That makes SCP-2183 officially the most unpredictable roller coaster in the entire world. The shortest recorded length of the non-physical section of track is 1,080 meters. That's almost double the length of the physical track. And the maximum length of the non-physical portion of the track has been 5,460 meters. which is over twice the length of the Nagashima Spa Land Steel Dragon 2000, the longest roller coaster in the world. But we know what you adrenaline junkies are thinking. It ain't just the length that gets a major buff, it's also the height and speed. Top recorded heights on the mid-air tracks have been up to 100 meters, making it the 5th tallest roller coaster in the world. And speeds have reached a face-melting 180 kilometers an hour, making it the 4th fastest roller coaster in the world. But maybe like Shania Twain, that don't impress you much. We get it. You're probably thinking, 5th tallest? 4th fastest? I thought you said this coaster was truly hardcore, SCP explained. But like a good coaster, that's just because we haven't hit you with the big twist yet. That twist being, everything we just told you only applies to when the carts are empty. When someone is actually on this absolute monster of a roller coaster, it starts to do things you wouldn't believe. For you to really understand just how off the rails crazy this train can go, we've got to tell you about D93730, also known as the Rider. When the Rider woke up that morning, neither he nor the Foundation researchers handling him knew he was going to become a legend. As far as D-classes go, this guy was actually pretty lucky, seeing that he'd been convicted of one of the less severe crimes that constitute D-class duty. He was actually part of a release program, allowing him to eventually exit the Foundation alive and return to a normal life after he'd been involved in a certain number of studies. It seemed like a pretty fair trade. However, this was a real pearls before swine situation. Any true coaster head would relish the opportunity to take a joyride on SCP-2183. It'd be the greatest honor of their lives. But for the Rider, all it was a source of sweaty palms and an increased heart rate. Ha! Talk about weak sauce, am I right? He had no idea he was in for the ride of his life, in what would be both the first and last human test of SCP-2183. They sat him down on one of the carts, strapped and buckled him in with the safety bar, and got that baby rolling. When the ride began, the carts took the normal path down the physical portion of the track. But as expected, things got crazy when the carts hit the anomalous portion. Though nobody expected just how crazy this ride would get, least of all our lucky little rider himself. Ha! If he could still talk, I'm sure he would have changed his tune by now. The rider's cart detached from the rest during the mid-air portion and took a sharp right, going off on its own adventure around the rest of the abandoned park. Everybody knew this was going to be something special, because even the Foundation squares had never seen a cart act like this before. It looped around the whole place several times before whizzing through the park like a cruise missile, weaving between rides, stalls, and concession stands with ease. It was traveling blink and you'll miss it fast. This thing wasn't just white knuckle intense, it was broken knuckle intense. The rest of the carts returned to the starting point again and came to a stop, but the rider wasn't getting off that easy. There's a reason we call SCP-2183 the most intense roller coaster in this crazy world of ours. The cart containing the rider went AWOL, heading north out of the park at high speeds, putting it on a disastrous collision course with a nearby town. Well, disastrous if you work for the SCP Foundation. Totally awesome for the rest of us. The thing about a ride on SCP-2183 is that you really get your money's worth. When people nickname this thing the Ride Never Ends, they don't just do that for fun. This ride literally never ends. Over the first few weeks of the rider's ride, the Foundation just tried to suppress news of sightings from spreading. Multiple people around the nearest Idaho towns reported seeing a flying roller coaster cart zipping around the sky. Thankfully for the killjoys of the world, that kind of thing is easily written off as a trick of the mind. But this didn't stop the rider's epic thrill ride from tearing it up all across Idaho. Over the next few months, this party train really hit the road. Metaphorically speaking, of course. This cart constantly remained 120 to 150 meters above the ground and kept traveling at consistent speeds of over 200 kilometers an hour. That makes it roughly tied for the second fastest roller coaster in the world. The people lucky enough to spot this bad boy in action reported that they heard a panicked, terrifying screaming coming from inside the cart as it passed. That's how you know that the rider was having a hell of a time in there. Real shame that anyone who spotted it got a big old dose of Class A amnestics from the Killjoy Brigade. Speaking of those squares, the SCP Foundation tried multiple times to stop the ride and save the rider from this awesome experience. They sent in helicopters and lowered ladders down to him, but the rider, perhaps finally appreciating what a gift he was given here, kept his arms fastened to his sides, his face forced into a permanent grimace. Nobody knew how he could still be alive, despite having no food or water in all this time. Ha! We can only guess it's because SCP-2183 is just that awesome. Anytime these Foundation dweebs try to get near the cart, it immediately undertook evasive maneuvers and got the hell out of there. Nobody could bring this ultimate ride to an end. In the end, the SCP Foundation proved they could take being anti-fun to straight-up military proportions. They approved firing a missile at this piece of coaster dream tech, hoping to finally bring its awesomeness to an end. After making a valiant effort to avoid them, the missile eventually struck the cart. They thought the rider inside was dead, but the cart kept flying for another 4 years before finally crashing 34 kilometers from the rest of the ride. Relatively unscathed, probably after crashing into one of those beefy Idaho pigeons. And as the Foundation would soon find out, the rider was still around too. He just wasn't in the cart anymore. Nope, he was suspended in the air in a seated position 124 meters above the crashed carts. We call him the rider, because he's still riding to this very day. And if anyone comes within a 50-meter radius of him in any direction, he'll just fly away until he's alone again. We don't know about you, but we think the rider's whole permanent flying situation isn't a horrific purgatory of eternal torment if he's alive under his comatose state. It's actually the ultimate ride. And really, what more could you want out of life, right? Sometimes people working on the site see him sitting in the cars, often only for a split second. He's one with the coaster now. Total nirvana. Like we said before, kids, the ride never ends.
A shot zipped past his head, narrowly missing, leaving an indent on the wall mere inches away. He froze, peeking out from cover, scanning the area for any sign of the enemy. Nothing, not a single movement. But still, he didn't feel the least bit safe. There was a more secure stronghold, a bunker only a short dash from where he was squatting. Gripping his weapon close to his chest, Private Mitchell took a deep breath, psyching himself up before rushing across the battlefield towards what he hoped would be better cover. Ducking under a camouflage tarp that covered the entrance, Mitchell was met with a sight of his squad mates, all sitting huddled in the foxhole, some looking dejected and miserable, others cowering in fear, all apart from Sergeant King, who sat cross-legged in one corner, wearing a permanently crazed, wide-eyed stare on his face. An exhausted Private Mitchell sat down with the others, unable to offer more insight than a nod of mutual condolence to his comrades. For a while, the members of MTF Iota-17, the unit codenamed the Greendale Humans, found themselves feeling the simultaneous mix of frightened and bored. Each one of them could have achieved the same sense of anxiety by drinking 10 cups of black coffee, loudly knocking on their drill sergeant's door in the middle of the night, then rushing back to their barracks to hide under their bunks. Movement from outside caused the whole team's heads to swivel, peeking out of a gap in the outer wall of the bunker. They saw the enemy immediately. Two of the ghostly incorporeal figures roaming the battlefield outside. Not to be underestimated despite the baggy, oversized tactical gear they wore, and weapons that looked too big for them. And two outside meant the other three were still out there somewhere. One gave a nod to the other, instructing him to scour the area surrounding the bunker. Mitchell was terrified, and all too aware that there were too many of them in the bunker. The enemy was bound to find them soon. All of a sudden, Sergeant King seemed to stir from his strange trance and produced a box of matches. He held out 4 in his hand, keeping them covered so that nobody could tell if they were picking a long one or a short one. The first of MTF Iota-17, Private Davis, reached for a match as they were offered, his heart dropping as Sergeant King pointed it was a short one. Next, Private Byron picked out a match, a long one. Private Mitchell's pulse skyrocketed as Sergeant King offered him the remaining 2, knowing that one would be long, the other short. He reached out and plucked a short one. King explained that the first short straw and the first long straw go. Bad luck, Byron and Davis, but I don't make the rules. Byron, not wanting to be at the mercy of the spirits, protested that those rules seemed made up. But Private Mitchell, even less eager to go out there, affirmed the sergeant's logic. Hanging their heads, both Private Byron and Private Davis gathered up their weapons and sluggishly walked out of the bunker. Moments later, still safe inside, Private Mitchell overheard the enemy taking fire, followed by the sound of splattering and yelps of pain from his 2 fallen squad mates. He offered a concerned look to Sergeant King, whose wide-eyed expression was doing little to ease Mitchell's nerves. "They got our boys good," King muttered, rocking slightly. Tagged them like the Bowery Wall. Still, lucky they didn't get hit by the cannonball. Mitchell asked in disbelief whether the enemy really had their hands on a cannon. No, the cannonball's just their name for it. The sergeant said solemnly. I've never seen it myself, but I heard rumors. Apparently these incorporeal delinquents sneak a steel ball in with their ammo. That's their way of keeping things interesting. Who was it that said war is hell, or was it war makes people crazy? Crazy. I was crazy once. Mitchell sighed and asked why they don't just throw in the towel and surrender. You know darn well why. The mad commanding officer barked. Chaos, mass hysteria, a whole new mess for the Foundation to clean up. And you listen here. Maybe you can live with that, but not me. Not on my watch. The private asked to be let in on the battle plan, unsure if he was more scared of Sergeant King or the enemy outside. We should drag one of them in here. Get him to give up enemy intel. King answered in a sinister, unhinged tone. He didn't respond well when told that the intangibility of the enemy may make holding one of them hostage, well, impossible. Still living in a fantasy, are you, Private? King chuckled maniacally and didn't stop for a full, unsettling minute. Look, I've had it up to here with the enemy and their dirty tactics. I say it's time we went full Return of the Jedi. We're the Ewoks and they're the Empire. Now belt up and bear out. Grabbing his weapon, Sergeant King suddenly hopped to his feet and bellowed, letting out a primal scream up towards the heavens. Then he rushed out of the bunker, screaming his own name until a barrage of enemy fire opened up from all directions. Still cowering in the safety of the bunker, Private Mitchell sighed again as he looked at his commanding officer covered in splatters of paint. Fortunately for Mitchell and the rest of MTF Iota 17, the injuries they had sustained in the line of duty were non-fatal, save for a few bruised egos and some stubborn paint stains on their uniforms that took a lot of seltzer water and lemon to wash out. The unfortunate downside, however, was that their defeat led to a localized anomalous event. The perpetrators of that incident, 5 ghost-like entities with a bad habit of painting the town red. Literally. Meet SCP-2629, sometimes more commonly referred to as the 29-year Paintball War. See if you can guess how it got that nickname. Located on the outskirts of Krakow, Poland, one can find an abandoned building that was previously used as an indoor paintballing venue. But now it's known to the SCP Foundation by its designation of SCP-2629. Inhabiting the location are a number of incorporeal entities, collectively known as SCP-2629-A. These are humanoid in their shape and behavior, but largely intangible. However, there are a few caveats to that which we'll circle back to. As for their appearance, despite being somewhat translucent, facial recognition software deployed by the Foundation has determined that these so-called ghosts bear a resemblance to a group of 5 teenagers, all of whom died during a driving accident. According to local police records, these deaths took place approximately 5 kilometers outside of Krakow, and there are no existing records that indicate the teenagers in question ever frequented the paintball venue, while they were alive anyway. Now, we mentioned not too long ago that these 5 entities aren't entirely incorporeal, or at least they aren't 100% intangible. The exceptions here are the projectiles fired from their weapons. In this case, standard paintballs with no anomalous properties remain physically tangible. They interact with the world in the same way you would expect any normal paintball to, splattering on impact with solid matter, usually a hard surface or a human target. And this exception to intangibility also works the same way in reverse. Any paintballs fired at any of SCP-2629-A will have the same expected effect. Any and all attempts by the SCP Foundation to engage in direct communications with SCP-2629-A have resulted in failure. While they will often engage in banter and trash talk with their opposition during games, they seem to be uninterested in talking about anything other than paintball. During one attempt by Foundation researcher Dr. Ben Kazarinsiak to talk with the entities and ask why they spend eternity in a paintball arena, the only answer given by one of the anomalous ghosts, SCP-2629-A-2, was, why not? Every afternoon at exactly 1 o'clock Central European Time, all members of SCP-2629-A will manifest within SCP-2629. Should they be left unattended, they will begin to roam freely, often gravitating towards the nearby neighborhood. This can lead to an event classified as an ALIF 2629 scenario. However, the occurrence of an ALIF scenario can be averted should the 5 entities be engaged in a game of paintball. It is the only known measure to deter them. and as such, the SCP Foundation has assigned Mobile Task Force Iota-17 to deal with the problem. Every day, all members of MTF Iota-17, the Greendale humans, enter the paintball facility via an underground tunnel. Each of these operatives possesses a high level of proficiency in marksmanship, as well as close-quarters combat utilizing firearms. On top of that, the Foundation insists that MTF troops in this unit also need to be great at paintball. The Foundation's MTF agents must engage the 5 members of SCP-2629-A in a game of paintball shortly after the entities manifest at 1 o'clock. The games follow the traditional capture the flag rules, wherein both teams have a flag that they need to protect, while also being tasked with securing the opposing team's flag. Should the Foundation's pro paintballers be successful in winning the match, then all instances of SCP-2629-A will demanifest peacefully until they return at the same time the following day. But should the 5 ghostly teammates prevail, or if MTF Iota-17 breaks any of the conventional paintball rules, then this will trigger an ALIF 2629 scenario. But exactly how long has this protracted paintball war been going on for? Well, the clue is in the nickname. All the way back in 1988, the SCP Foundation received reports of unusual vandalism taking place in the area near Krakow. That might have been enough to pique their initial interest, but the sudden reported sightings of ghosts by local civilians was what really made them take interest. Descending on the small area outside of Krakow, the Foundation launched a full-scale investigation into SCP-2629. Given what we now know about the anomaly, it seems that with no one to challenge them, the 5 paintballing entities were free to enact an ALIF 2629 scenario unobstructed. Once the Foundation discovered the site of SCP-2629 and determined it to be the source of the local anomalous activity, they got to work evacuating the immediate vicinity of the abandoned paintball arena and devising containment procedures to keep unwitting civilians from getting caught in the crossfire of an imminent paint-slinging conflict. As far as the public would know, the abandoned SCP-2629 venue was shut down thanks to a hazardous amount of asbestos. Its entrances were sealed off to deter vandals and would-be urban explorers. But in reality, the Foundation was keeping people out so that the first match between their team, MTF Iota-17, and the 5 members of SCP-2629-A could commence. The battle was relentless, paintballs flying in all directions, splattering any in their path. The Foundation lost a lot of good men that day, although they quickly found them again once they'd cleaned up all the paint. In an attempt to shift the tide of battle and turn the odds in the Foundation's favor, MTF operatives rearranged some of the indoor playing field. This, however, was an ill-advised strategic misstep, as messing with the venue's cover violated the established rules of paintball, and doing so caused an ALIF 2629 scenario to begin. In response, a number of ALIF 2629 procedures have been put in place to combat the anomalous event. Staff at Site-19 had to equip the protective paintballing gear stored at their workstations or in lockers around the facility. If any of them couldn't access their gear, the next best thing Foundation personnel could do was cover their eyes and ears until the event passed. Any and all delicate equipment had to be stored for safety purposes. Security staff are tasked with making sure any SCPs that might be vulnerable are kept out of harm's way. The Foundation currently has no way of barring SCP-2629-A's access to areas, thanks to their incorporeality. However, they can be deterred by being presented with an abundance of targets. Staff are to remain on high alert until the ALIF 2629 scenario is over and the all-clear signal sounds. With all this preparation taking place at Site-19 no less, you'd expect an ALIF 2629 scenario to entail something pretty catastrophic. It wasn't always such an issue. During the initial decade following SCP-2629's discovery, the ALIF scenario used to entail the 5 SCP-2629-A entities roaming the nearby area of Krakow and opening fire on people and property with their paintball guns. Hardly a paint-based war crime, but definitely goes an unnecessary extra mile in terms of vandalism. Then again, you try being stuck for an eternity in a paintball arena. Sometimes it's nice to stretch the invisible space where your legs used to be. And by now you've probably made the connection, the unusual vandalism that drew the Foundation to SCP-2629 in the first place was the ghostly teenage paintballers literally painting the town whenever they manifested, only to fade away after a few hours. But that's only what the ALIF scenario used to entail. It happened during the 12th consecutive year of the Paintball War. A third MTF loss against SCP-2629-A caused yet another ALIF scenario to activate. But this time, instead of roaming the local neighborhood, the incorporeal teens' victory sent them to one of the Foundation's most highly guarded facilities, Site-19. Multiple unsuspecting Foundation research personnel were splattered with paint, the first of the Paintball War's casualties to fall outside of a 250-meter radius from SCP-2629. The Foundation launched an inquiry into how these 5 incorporeal anomalies were able to breach the security of Site-19, citing loose lips among MTF Iota-17 about Site-19. As such, they were banned from ever mentioning Foundation operations during their paintball skirmishes with SCP-2629-A. However, the lasting damage was already done, and unlike a paintball splatter, there was no wiping this away or covering it up. Every loss that MTF Iota-17 incurred in the coming years would result in all 5 of SCP-2629-A manifesting within Site-19, celebrating their capture the flag victories by committing paintball retribution against Foundation personnel. Staff and corridors were splattered with paint, and attempts to return paintball fire were unsuccessful in dispersing the incorporeal attackers. One researcher even sustained an eye injury after being struck in the eye by a stray paintball. As the years rolled on, MTF Iota-17's losses began to increase rapidly. More and more ALIF 2629 scenarios were occurring each year. Foundation facilities abruptly and messily redecorated by a volley of paintballs. The Site-19 director issued a communique to the Ethics Committee, requesting the termination of SCP-2629. MTF Iota-17 may have some of the best trained people in the world, but SCP-2629-A have been gaining experience for decades. It was only a matter of time before the skill gap closed. Anyone we recruit to fill a vacancy in MTF Iota-17 is going to need to be able to counter nearly 30 years of paintball experience, and that number is always growing. All 5 of SCP-2629-A had already gotten tired of trashing their own neighborhood, and before long, they'd similarly get bored of trashing Site-19. The question was, once that happened, where would they hit next?
True horror. The airplane door, belching smoke, and a burning red light. The dead talking in ancient guttural Latin. A monstrous angel made of rings, wings, and eyes whipping barbed tentacles at screaming, terrified priests. You can scarcely imagine a more hellish place. Bishop Franklin's knees gave out under him as soon as the man set foot back on solid ground. Nearing his 70th birthday, he'd never been a particularly tough man, but after the day he'd had, he doubted he'd ever be the same again. Almost being ripped into another dimension, almost being at the center of a nuclear explosion, seeing. He threw up on the ground as the Foundation personnel rushed over to him. Never, never again. Just 8 hours earlier, Bishop Franklin had been getting on with his Friday preparations. They had Mass coming up this weekend, so he was doing the rounds of the cathedral, putting out new candles and straightening pews. He was nearly done, ready to get on with the rest of his morning, when he saw 2 suited figures entering the cathedral. He shuffled over to them, trying to explain that they were closed, but quickly faltered when he saw the grave look on their faces. Just 10 minutes later, he was in the back of their car, still holding a spare candle, with agents from the SCP Foundation sitting on either side of him. They handed him file after file, each most redacted, explaining the basis of who they were and where they were headed. It was a lot for the old priest to wrap his head around. He'd always believed in a higher power and a spiritual realm, but this sounded a whole lot more serious than that. Monsters, aliens, other dimensions, facilities, portals. He questioned the agents on it. They just looked grimly from one to another as the car wound its way to the private airstrip in the middle of nowhere. Bishop Franklin had always hated flying, but he hated it a whole lot more as he approached the airplane with no idea where he'd be landing. A small group of men were gathered on the runway just by the foot of a Boeing aircraft. It seemed like a pretty substantial plane for such a small group of them. He was at least a little heartened to see that none of them had brought luggage either. In fact, most of them were just like him. As Bishop Franklin approached the group, he recognized various faces, other bishops, archbishops, and senior priests. With him there, they totaled 7. The others all looked at him, not saying much. Bishop Franklin tried his best to start asking questions, but two things happened in quick succession that closed his mouth very quickly. Firstly, the luggage hold of the plane was opened, and two enormous shapes were loaded into it via forklift. Each shape had unmistakable symbols on the sheets covering them. Nuclear danger. Reeling from this revelation, Bishop Franklin turned to the group to be face to face with the Pope himself. He immediately shut his mouth. You may also be wondering what on earth was going on at this airfield. The truth is, Bishop Franklin, along with 6 other priests of Abrahamic faiths, were about to embark on the monthly flight of SCP-616. Within this plane, as all of these men were soon about to find out, exists an emergency door. Covered with satanic iconography, this door, when opened at ground level, operates just like any other emergency door, leading to the outside of the plane. Although any individuals who had passed through this door in this normal state reported feeling heightened anxiety during and after. However, once a month, this door will be anything but normal, opening a gate to, well, you'll soon see. In order to mitigate the threat posed to humanity through SCP-616-1, or the Gate, the plane must be in the air at the time of its opening, far above and away from any human settlements. In order to keep this event contained, the door must be kept open for the duration of the portal's existence until it has closed of its own accord. But holding this door open is not a simple test of strength, it is a test of belief. In order to protect all of humanity from unknown horrors of a cataclysmic scale, 7 priests of Abrahamic faiths must be on board for this monthly flight, praying for the door to remain open. The ability to keep the door open, it turns out, is unrelated to physical prowess, but instead is based entirely on one's own belief that the door can be held open. As such, religious figures praying to a higher power are incredibly well suited to the task. Once per year, the flight is blessed by the Pope, and every time the plane takes off, it must be holding 2 nuclear warheads in its hull. Both can be remotely detonated by the ground team, who will be in constant radio communication with the pilot. Should the pilot fail to give them regular updates on the status of SCP-616-1, the event will be treated as an XK-class end-of-the-world scenario, and both nuclear devices will be detonated without hesitation. But Bishop Franklin only knew about half of this information from his redacted set of documents, and had forgotten half of them on his stressful car journey. As he strapped himself into a window seat, he was trembling like a leaf. He desperately wanted to complain about being put into this situation, but he wasn't entirely sure who he would complain to. If he spoke to anyone external about what he was about to witness, he had been told by the Foundation agents that he would be administered with a Class C amnestic, whatever that meant. He really didn't want to find out. Fortunately for him, the most familiar of the faces from the group of priests sat next to him in the aisle seat. Bishop... what was his name? Sensing Bishop Franklin's uncertainty, the man reached a hand over and warmly reintroduced himself. Bishop Pete. They'd met 2 years ago in Berlin. Just that small action was almost enough to settle Bishop Franklin's nerves as the plane started to barrel down the runway. Almost. The plane took off, causing the old man's stomach to drop. Heart hammering, he looked around, spotting the emergency door. It was just up ahead of him, around the middle of the fuselage. It would have looked like a normal emergency exit, but for the blood-red markings scrawled across it. A wave of dread washed over him. It certainly looked evil, that was for sure. Trying his best to help, Bishop Pete struck up a conversation. He explained it wasn't his first time doing this. He'd been drafted to help 3 months ago. It was scary for sure, but everything was totally fine. The Foundation had planned everything to a T. It would have helped Bishop Franklin's nerves, but it only made his mind jump to the nuclear weapons he'd seen loaded into where his suitcase would have normally gone. The two of them lapsed into silence for a while. No one on the plane was really speaking. He supposed he should have used this opportunity to pray, but according to his briefing, he'd be doing a lot of that very soon. He hadn't entirely understood what the Foundation had meant by that. He'd been told to pray to, quote, keep the door open. What had they meant by that? A bang shattered the silence as the emergency door slammed wide open. In an instant, the plane went into a nosedive as all the air rushed from inside. The lights went out for several seconds, then came back on in flashing, panicked spasms. Bishop Franklin clung for dear life onto the back of the chair in front of him as the roar of air rushed around him. It had gone dark outside, with shapeless clouds swirling around him, shaking the plane. Screaming voices filled the aircraft, not just the voices of the men on board, but women and children too, crying out in agony and terror through throats that sounded like they'd been lashed with razor wire. Then he saw it. SCP-616-1. The gate was wide open. Smoke billowed out of it, crawling along the floors of the cabin like an octopus creeping its way along the ocean floor. Red light seemed to spill out of it, but when he tried to look through the gate itself, it was like his brain wasn't working anymore. There were colors there, but there were ones he didn't recognize. Maybe they weren't colors at all. It was like his brain fixated on trying to sort them into something that made sense, something rational. A hand grasped his arm and he turned to see Bishop Pete staring at him with wild eyes. The plane was going down, they could both feel it, and that emergency door was slowly creeping shut. They had been brought onto this plane for one job only, to pray, like their lives depended on it. Bishop Franklin screwed his eyes shut and clasped his hands together. He hadn't prayed like that since he was a little kid, but he figured now was the time to use all the tricks in the book. He begged and pleaded in a tiny voice for God to keep that door open. It felt so counterintuitive, so backwards, to want to keep that kind of door open as the air roared and screamed around him. But a small voice inside of him told him to persevere, have a little faith. But suddenly, the bishop noticed that the man sitting alongside him had fallen silent. Feeling like a naughty child at mass, he opened one eye and peered sideways. Bishop Pete was still in his seat, but he'd slumped over. He wasn't breathing. His skin was cold to the touch, deathly cold. Then all of a sudden, his head rocketed backwards and he started talking. Not talking like a normal man, but talking like a man possessed. His dead eyes rolled around in his head aimlessly as guttural voices rasped out of his throat. None of them were the words that Bishop Franklin recognized. They sounded almost like Latin, but far darker and more ancient. And the more the dead man spoke, the more the emergency door closed. The bishop started praying again, much harder this time, digging his fingernails into his palms so hard that he felt them drawing blood. He needed to keep this door open. He had to, and he could. He believed it entirely in that moment. The door banged back open, wider than ever despite the chanting of the dead body in the seat next to him. Nightmares swelled to the forefront of his mind as the plane hurtled to the ground. Only the plane wasn't hurtling to the ground. In fact, it was flying at a perfectly steady altitude of 10,972 meters, with an airspeed of about 780 kilometers an hour. In fact, aside from the death of Bishop Pete, everything within the plane was going perfectly to plan. Deaths of priests were just an occupational hazard of keeping this SCP contained. The pilot at the front of the plane regarded the whole situation playing out behind him while feeding constant information back to base. Everything was going perfectly according to plan, until the angel appeared. Bishop Franklin wasn't the first one to see it. That was the unfortunate lot of Archbishop Michael, who was sitting closest to the emergency door. He first spied it while staring through into the void, but his screams of terror, warning those around him, were drowned out by all the other commotion. It was only when the angel's wings crept their way through the edges of the door and the creature let itself into the cabin that the others saw it, but by this point, it was too late for Archbishop Michael. The angel was not like the angels we see in pop culture, a tall blonde person with white robes, fluffy wings, and a gentle face. It was a shifting mess of eyes and tortured wings, partially crawling along the ground, partially floating under the weight of its massive frame. It had to squeeze itself through the door to fit into the plane, but as it did, it lashed out at the Archbishop with a sinewy tendril and got to work, violently killing him. That was when Bishop Franklin saw it and began to panic. He wanted nothing more than to stop praying, to let the emergency door slam shut and keep this creature away from them. But that little voice inside his head told him that wouldn't work. If that door was allowed to close before the gate had, then it would cause the apocalypse. He could not have that blood on his hands. So he prayed, sweat pouring down his face as the angel forced its way through the gate and into the cabin. He prayed as it slumped across the aisles, working its way along the line of men, slaughtering them one by one. He prayed as it saw him and rose to its full height, unfurling great wings and readying itself for the kill. And he prayed as a wind more powerful than any on earth blew through the cabin and pulled the angel back through the gate. The emergency door slammed shut, and in an instant, the plane seemed to right itself. No more turbulence, no more wind. The light flickered once more and then came back on steadily. The seatbelt sign pinged off, and oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling about 4 hours too late. Bishop Franklin couldn't believe the time when he looked at his wristwatch. He had been on this plane for weeks, surely, not just 4 hours. That was absurd. It all felt like a dream as the aircraft circled around the airstrip, preparing for landing. Everything in the plane seemed totally normal to him now, except of course for the 4 dead bodies, one of which was slumped towards him in the aisle seat. The plane landed. The bishop staggered down the stairs and threw up on the blacktop. After a few awkward moments, the pilot sidled over to him and muttered a quick thanks. "I was really close to calling it a failure there and having to set off them nukes. I don't know what you prayed for, but you did good today." Bishop Franklin didn't feel like he did good. He felt like he'd had his whole life, his whole worldview, turned upside down in the space of an interstate flight. He had been moments away from either being vaporized by a nuclear bomb or from having economy seats to the premiere of the destruction of the world as we knew it. But just 31 days later, Bishop Franklin was on that same flight again, praying his hardest as the aircraft dropped into freefall. If there was one thing that the Foundation noticed about working with religious leaders, it was that they had a real determination to keep coming back to help keep the world safe. What the Foundation didn't have the heart to tell them was that all of the satanic markings on the door were actually fake. They had been added by researchers in an attempt to make SCP-616-1 carry more significance for those in the aircraft. Later testing revealed that it was not exclusive to Abrahamic faiths, or any faith groups for that matter, that they could keep the gate open. Anyone who believed they could do it was capable of it. Faith leaders, however, are still being utilized, and the blessing is still being performed by the Pope on a yearly basis. It had been found that these external rituals, while not necessarily directly impactful, have strengthened the belief and resolve of those inside the plane, yielding fewer casualties and shorter durations. Various experiments have been conducted to see beyond the event horizon of the gate, to see what's on the other side. Those in the plane have reported as having the name Paradise, despite never going inside. A remote-controlled rover was sent inside the gate on one experiment, but the footage was deemed far too dangerous as all those who witnessed it died within 2 months. Hopefully, you didn't peer too closely into the gate as you watched this video.
Jack was swimming deep underwater, wondering why he had such a pounding headache when suddenly he had a terrifying realization. He had no idea where he was or what he was doing. There was a nagging feeling that he must have a specific reason to be here. You don't just end up deep in the ocean with a diving suit on by chance. Yet he had no idea what he was supposed to be doing. He wasn't sure he cared either. He was more worried about the throbbing pain in his head and the vision of 2 eyes staring at him out of the dark that he couldn't get out of his mind. His heart began to race as he wondered what to do and how to get help. He was in the middle of the ocean and appeared to be all alone. He couldn't see anything in the dark water except for this weird gray substance in front of him. Maybe he was going to die here alone. Without knowing if anyone could even hear him, he began to speak aloud about how he was consumed by sickness and that darkness was all around him. This is the story of one of the most powerful and dangerous anomalies yet discovered, SCP-3000. Before Jack's descent into despair, the SCP Foundation had mandated an exploratory expedition off the coast of Bangladesh. After receiving a few strange reports from locals and fishermen, the Foundation suspected an SCP was lurking in the water and positioned a few personnel to investigate. The crew expected danger, or maybe even death. But what they got instead was far stranger and more ominous. All of the men had been verified to be in sound mental states when the mission set out, but a few of them reported feeling strange and uneasy as the submarine descended into the ocean. Before long, a veteran agent named Dr. Williams began to panic in a way that was completely out of character. He started sweating profusely, shaking, and wouldn't listen to a word of comfort or reason that anybody tried to offer. It might seem like a relatively normal reaction for anyone descending into the depths of the ocean to meet with a monster that they don't know anything about, but Dr. Williams was a seasoned professional who had been on hundreds of such missions before. There was no logical reason for him to act like this. Although the reaction of Dr. Williams was the most extreme, he wasn't the only one who started to feel strange. Multiple agents developed a creeping feeling of unease that swept over them. One of the calmer men tried to reason with Dr. Williams, asking him what was wrong and if he could explain exactly how he was feeling. That's when things got even stranger. Not only was the doctor extremely anxious, but he now seemed incapable of giving a real response to any questions thrown at him. He could only mutter that he was missing something, but he wasn't sure what. Knowing that many SCPs can bend reality and the human mind, many of the personnel began to have second thoughts about the mission and even asked for permission to call off the mission. But they were mandated to continue, so they went on. As the team went deeper and deeper into the ocean, things only got worse. Even the previously calm crew members became spooked and antsy, while the ones who were already anxious were now sweating and jittering. As for Dr. Williams, he was now pacing back and forth around the submarine, saying things nobody could understand. Every time he looked at his colleagues and his close friends, he seemed to stare straight through them and would call them by the wrong names. It was as if his mind had moved to a different dimension. Whenever someone asked him to perform his normal duties, he looked more confused than ever. Still, the team went deeper. Dr. Williams began to whimper and say the word no repeatedly, growing louder and louder until he was screaming, and the others were forced to sedate him. Just then, something came into view. It was what would come to be known as SCP-3000. The thing was huge, so huge that its whole body couldn't be seen out of the submarine window. It was a horrible eel-looking creature with a head as big as a town and haunting eyes that lit up the black ocean around it. But perhaps the strangest part was this giant eel seemed to be producing a weird gray liquid. Even the sedative wasn't enough to keep Dr. Williams calm anymore. There was a strange blank look in his eyes as if the light and life had left him, and he just began screaming no repeatedly again and wouldn't respond to any attempts to calm him down. Not that anyone else was very capable of calming him down at this point. Even the crew members that had been holding up well were starting to act strangely, and nobody could get the image of these ominous eyes out of their heads. Then things went from bad to worse. Williams began screaming and shouting madly as if he was being tortured by an unseen force. The men tried to restrain him, but it was no use. He began smashing his head against the submarine window until it cracked, putting the whole mission and everyone's life at risk. He fell to the ground injured, chanting that there was nothing, whatever that meant. It was an emergency scenario. They began applying first aid to Williams as the submarine ascended to the surface as quickly as possible before the pressure of the ocean caused the cracked window to explode. By the time they reached the surface, Williams was dead. But there was something even more chilling than the circumstances of his death. Every single man who had been in that submarine experienced the same thing on the days that came afterward. The image of the eel-like creature's eyes seemed burned in their minds permanently. It would haunt their waking hours for the rest of their lives, and sleep was no escape either, as they would appear in both their dreams and nightmares alike forever. A second mission had to be sent to gather more information about the strange beast. Already, there were many theories and question marks surrounding SCP-3000. How big was it really? Was it sentient? What was the liquid for? None of the men who had been on the previous mission were willing to return to the waters, but a new group of brave recruits volunteered. They were about to find out what so many in history have learned the hard way, that bravery and foolishness are often mistaken for the same thing. This time, the mission would not be in a submarine, but in dive suits, in order to observe the anomaly in even closer detail, and to eliminate the chance of one team member self-sabotaging the submarine, killing them all. They were transported to the location by boat, and the three men splashed into the ocean. They descended, and at first everything was going well. In case anything went wrong, the three of them were tethered together for extra security. But the deeper into the ocean they swam, and the closer they got to SCP-3000's location they got, the stranger things became, just like on the last mission. First, there were a few minor cases of confusion. One of the team, Jack, thought it was his responsibility to lead the navigation, but another, Roberto, also thought it was his job. In fact, navigation was actually the job of a third team member, Amir, but he seemed to have forgotten. Everyone was getting confused. The team listening in on the conversations at the Foundation headquarters grew increasingly concerned about what they could hear. Was everyone losing their minds? Hopefully, nobody was about to pull another Dr. Williams on them. Still, the project leads couldn't afford to tell the men to come back to the surface. The Foundation badly needed any information they could get on this SCP, whatever the cost, so they told the men to press on. Things only got worse. Roberto was asking to speak to a colleague who passed away 2 years ago, while the others began to mutter indistinguishable phrases about eyes and darkness, not too dissimilar to the ramblings of Dr. Williams. It increasingly began to look like a suicide mission. Then, there was silence. What was going on? Each of the men had completely lost it, to the point that they cut the tether that was holding them together. All alone, Jack couldn't remember where he was or why he was here. He desperately looked around to try and gauge his surroundings, but he could only see darkness. All he could think about was a pair of large eyes and an overwhelming fear of despair and anxiety, and this weird gray fluid that was now floating in front of him. The Foundation listened as Jack started reciting a creepy speech about being on the edge of nothing, inches from oblivion, with a sickness in his mind and nothing but a pair of eyes in front of him. They listened in horror as they heard movement through the radio. It sounded like a huge creature was swimming toward the men. It had to be SCP-3000, but all three men were too confused to do anything about the situation or to even see what was in front of them, claiming they couldn't see anything in the darkness. There was silence for half a minute, with the team listening in, fearing the worst. Then they heard some more unintelligible mutterings. The men must be alive, but what on earth was going on? Then the gibberish started again. Two of the men were screaming that Jack had just been swallowed whole and that they were being sucked in too. Why couldn't they just swim away? It was chaos. But then a few moments later, Roberto spoke into the radio, saying he was floating alone in the middle of the ocean and had now moved away from the eyes of SCP-3000. He finally seemed capable of forming coherent thoughts and speech. After what had just happened, Roberto now had a theory. He thought that somehow it was impossible to think straight around SCP-3000. When he'd been close enough to see the eyes, Roberto had felt a throbbing pain in his brain and been unable to think about anything. Perhaps it was something to do with that mysterious gray liquid. Even more slime was coming out of SCP-3000 now, and Roberto was determined to get a sample despite the warnings from HQ. In one final burst of motivation, he swam close enough to take some of the gray liquid and put it in a special sample collection unit that was designed to float to the surface for collection later. He had acquired some very important data, but he seemed to have lost all hope of preserving his life. Roberto started telling the team over the radio that he was dying and that his heart rate was too high, but cautioned that it would be too dangerous for anyone to try and rescue him. The personnel continued to try and communicate with Roberto to figure out what was going on, but his words had stopped making any sense until finally he went quiet. Minutes turned into hours, hours into days, and still there was no sign of Roberto or the rest of the divers. After 3 days, his radio, which had only been sending a steady stream of static, finally stopped working altogether and he was presumed dead. However, the sample Roberto had collected had survived and made it to the hands of the Foundation researchers. It turned out to be a viscous substance now known as Y909, a chemical compound and extremely strong anesthesia. Y909 causes head pain, paranoia, fear, panic, memory loss, and confusion, explaining what happened to Dr. Williams and the diving trio. The collection of Y909 might have resulted in 2 disastrous missions, but there's a silver lining as the substance ended up becoming an invaluable tool for the SCP Foundation. Its ability to make people forget what had just happened to them can be used to eliminate knowledge of threatening SCPs among the public. It also helps the Foundation staff cope with the traumatic experiences they encounter on their missions. Although other amnestics can be used for the same purpose, none are as powerful as the one produced by SCP-3000. Before its discovery, the amnestics used would break down too quickly, not fare well in storage, or cause undesirable side effects. The only problem is the method of sourcing. The only way to obtain Y909 is somewhat ethically questionable for most people. SCP-3000 produces Y909 after eating, so the best way to stock up on it is by feeding the creature. Sedated D-Class personnel from the Foundation are sent on missions supposedly to observe the anomaly up close, unaware that this mission is one way only. Other divers are then sent later to collect the fluid from a safe distance and store it. Of course, it's all for the greater good of humanity. Now, the Foundation protects SCP-3000 as best as it can guard something hundreds of kilometers long. The area is carefully patrolled, and members of the public are not allowed to enter the part of the bay where it resides. Anybody who accidentally comes into contact is contained. Eventually, another pair of Foundation doctors went down in a submarine to try and learn more about SCP-3000. One became so affected by Y909 that he began hallucinating. He started talking about Anantashesha, the king of serpents in Hinduism. Anantashesha is believed to be all that will be left after the end of the world because it exists throughout all of time simultaneously. The doctor said he believed that this was in fact Anantashesha, that SCP-3000 simply shows us that eventually everyone dies and fades into the darkness of oblivion, right before he exited the submarine and swam right into his mouth. Luckily for now, SCP-3000 seems to be in a sort of hibernation state. It rarely moves and it doesn't hunt, although it will eat when fed. But no one knows when or if it'll wake, or what it's capable of if it does. Will it destroy the world, or simply drive us all insane?
The diver screams a silent scream as the giant squid's beak digs into his skin, its many grasping tentacles grabbing him and holding him in place. Nearby, his fellow divers are driven half-mad with terror as they see mysterious figures floating towards them through the murk, and strange Russian voices speaking in their heads. Nobody can help them. They're down too deep, too consumed by the darkness and the pressure of the sea. They're now at the mercy of whatever is inside the submarine. Beginning in the 1940s, with the dawn of nuclear weapons, the American government conducting the world's first atomic weapons test, and the Soviet Union responding in kind with nuclear testing of their own, the two powers entered an arms race fueled by rivalry and a thirst to prove their strength on the world stage. What followed were decades of staggering technological advancements as each nation tried to outdo and intimidate the other. The Soviet Union crossed into the cold reaches of outer space, deploying the satellite Sputnik. The United States responded with the founding of NASA. Tensions reached a fever pitch during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, as United States citizens feared they were teetering on the brink of nuclear war. In July of 1968, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States came together to sign the Treaty on the Non-Proliferation of Nuclear Weapons, agreeing to abandon their pursuit of increasing nuclear power and turn their focus to disarmament. But several months before the treaty was signed, the Soviet government was dealing in weaponry far more dangerous than nuclear missiles, something the other world powers knew nothing about. These deadly secrets were hidden aboard a submarine known as SCP-741. SCP-741 is the underwater wreckage of a Soviet submarine that sank in March of 1968 and came into the custody of the SCP Foundation in 1999. The submarine, a version of the Charlie II class, was deployed under unusual circumstances, which attracted the attention of the United States government. In an attempt to learn more about the submarine, the US government launched Project Redacted, which attempted to recover the vessel from the ocean in the early 1970s. They managed to recover a few pieces of the vessel, though the specifics are highly classified. In the late 1990s, the US government contacted the SCP Foundation, informing them of a possible Euclid or Keter-class anomaly in the wreck. At this point, it passed into the custody and surveillance of the Foundation. The submarine is on the ocean floor, broken into 3 pieces. The hull was broken into bits during Project Redacted recovery attempt, but was largely intact when it first sank except for 2 holes, one just in front of the sail and one just below the starboard missile tubes. Apparently, the vessel sank rapidly due to flooding after an enemy missile strike, which occurred while it was surfacing. Though all parts of the submarine are accounted for, no members of the crew have been located. Additionally, none of the emergency escape equipment on board has been used, raising further questions about what became of the crew. Wherever they went, they seem to have left something behind. Whenever divers are sent down to investigate the wreckage, they report experiencing anomalous currents and strange sea life, and hearing moans, disembodied voices, and incoherent whispering. They also report seeing blurry, faintly glowing figures. Additionally, the ocean life in the area is unnaturally aggressive, particularly large squid and sharks. This effect was first noted during a manned expedition into the waters around the wreckage, described in Incident Report 1741-A. Divers A-26 through A-30 embarked from the icebreaker Yamal into the waters below with the intention of studying the potential anomalous activity surrounding the wreckage. As the group of divers approached the submarine, they could feel the shift in the water around them, the oppressive feeling of abnormally increasing pressure bearing down and threatening to crush them. If their specialized diving equipment were to fail, they knew that would be it. and the command would have to come and fish their corpses out of the water. Or even worse, they would vanish entirely, meeting the same mysterious fate as the crew of that doomed submarine. But they couldn't fixate on that. They had a job to do. At first glance, the wreckage appeared undisturbed, unchanged since the previous inspection. Still, they needed to take a closer look to be sure. As the team got closer to the vessel, A30 was startled by the sight of movement from within the wreckage, spotting motion through one of the holes in the structure as something passed by. He pointed it out to his colleagues, but they dismissed it as likely a giant isopod or spider crab, which were crawling all over the surrounding area. A30 laughed off his jumpiness, agreed that they were probably right, and continued the exploration as planned. Control authorized the divers to proceed to the next step, and A29 activated sonar and lights, moving toward the starboard side breach. There, a faint glowing caught his eye. The glow resembled that of radioactive material, but when the team checked the radiation levels in the area, they remained stable. Whatever the source of the glow was, it wasn't radioactive. At this point, his neutron counter began to register something, and all of a sudden, a disembodied voice could be heard saying, "Vasily Yevgeny, can you hear me?" The voice was muffled, and though it could be heard over their communication channels, it emanated from somewhere in the wreckage, deep, deep underwater. As A29 watched, a glowing shape emerge from the darkness. It was only an outline, the suggestion of a silhouette, but the shape was undeniably familiar. It looked like a person. The other divers quickly noted the apparition too and began to panic. Some checked their nitrogen levels, believing it to be some sort of nitrogen narcosis, while others pointed out that they couldn't all be suffering from nitrogen narcosis at the same time. The unknown voice continued speaking, saying, "Help me, it is getting hard to breathe." The divers debated what to do next, questioning whether what they were seeing was even real, when all at once, the humanoid figure vanished from sight. The divers attempted to shake off the startling encounter, and they resumed their duties, the investigation proceeding as normal. After a few moments of uneventful work, another interruption presented itself in the form of a 5-meter-long squid swimming around the wreckage. Its presence startled the divers at first, particularly those closest to the animal, but the others encouraged them to ignore it, citing the fact that there are no records of these squid attacking humans. So they did, continuing their work as the squids circled them with apparent curiosity. A27 spotted an unusual shell below the wreckage, notably large and difficult to identify, and Control requested that they bring it up to the surface for further inspection by a marine biologist. The diver began attaching haul cables to the shell as the squid crept closer and closer. All of a sudden, A26 screamed, and there was a sudden bloom of blood in the water. The squid, despite it being uncharacteristic behavior for its species, attacked the diver, biting him savagely. Prompted by cries for help from the diving team, Control began to reel A26 back towards the surface, proceeding slowly to give him decompression time, and the squid took advantage of the slow retreat. It chased after the diver, grabbing hold of him and biting down again, tearing away at him as it gripped him in its tentacles. Still, Control continued reeling him in, hoping to free him from the squid's grasp as they yanked him to the surface. The other divers were ordered to get themselves out of there as fast as possible, an order they gladly obeyed. As they swam back to the surface, A30 saw something else moving in the depths. He couldn't make out what it was, but the sight of it gave him a sick feeling of dread deep in the pit of his stomach. The 4 divers were recovered alive, along with the shell. Examination of the shell indicated that it resembled that of the extinct orthoconic nautiloids, but it was not fossilized. It was taken for further study, given the possible implication of extinct species anomalously manifesting in the vicinity of SCP-714. Diver A26 lost a limb and was exposed to an unknown venom via bites from the attacking squid. His camera was destroyed in the process. As squid are not known to attack humans unprovoked, this behavior has been attributed to the influence of SCP-741, though the exact link between the two is yet to be determined. An anomalous pressure gradient surrounds the wreck with a radius of approximately 250 meters, starting around the center of the submarine. The pressure in this area is much greater than it should be, given the depth of the waters there. This unusually high pressure makes sonar analysis extremely difficult, as well as threatening the safety of any divers in the vicinity of the wreck. The few records that the Foundation has managed to obtain from the Russian and US governments indicate that the submarine was being used to transport some sort of secret cargo. Though the specifics of this cargo are still unknown, there is reason to believe that it differed from any type of nuclear or chemical weaponry. On a date redacted from official files, the SCPs Basisti was patrolling the area around SCP-741 when its sonar detected some unknown entity approaching SCP-741 from the south at a pace of 46 knots. The crew compared the acoustic signature of the contact with known submarines and torpedoes, but could not find a match. The Basisti attempted to reach the contact via sonobuoy drops and active sonar pings, but it did not respond. When the contact crossed into the total underwater exclusion zone, it became classified as hostile. At that point, the sonar recorded sounds of an undersea missile launch, and Basisti responded with the utmost urgency. The ship broke away from its original area and fired a Type 53 torpedo at the underwater threat. 15 seconds after the Basisti launched its torpedo, missiles of an unidentified configuration were seen breaking the water, flying at a height of 1.8 meters and a velocity of 0.92 Mach. The missiles did not emit any detectable radar, nor did they respond to any launch chaff or flares from the Basisti. Both of the missiles were engaged by Basisti's 3KN-5 Kinsul surface-to-air missiles and Kashtan point defense systems, and were destroyed at 1,800 meters and 210 meters from impact, respectively. After the missiles were neutralized, the hostile vessel could be heard engaging in evasive maneuvers. At this point, there were 4 closely spaced explosions and the sound of a submarine disintegrating. The identity of the attacker, as well as its intention toward SCP-741, have not yet been determined. The incident resulted in the Foundation research team suggesting an expansion of the acoustic sensor net, as well as additional patrol and defense assets placed in the area. Additionally, they advised an acquisition of undersea retaliatory capability. The incident was classified Incident 1741-C. The sonar recordings from the SCPs Basisti during Incident 1741-C were taken for further analysis by the research team. The in-depth review revealed anomalous acoustic signatures that did not match up with any known forms of propulsion, including magneto-hydrodynamic drive. Currently, the nature of the unidentified attacker remains a mystery, and it has not been attributed to any particular government or organization. Following the incident involving the SCPs Basisti, an American intelligence agent reached out to the Foundation, offering further insight into the secretive government programs looking into SCP-741. He agreed to sit for an interview with a Foundation researcher assigned to the project, on the condition that his identity remain protected. The SCP researcher's name is absent from the official file as well. The two men sat in a Foundation interview room, and the interviewer asked his informant why he chose to come forward, given the US government had simply chosen to sit on this information for 30 years. You've seen those reports. Project Redacted. Now, we know that part too. How the directors didn't make the connection is beyond me. That and the stuff the Redacted pulled up? Yeah, the other part you don't hear about is what some of the research team died of. And the crewmen we buried? Just uniforms. Also, the nuclear device we recovered wasn't a missile or torpedo warhead. It was a demolition charge. Does that make any sense? After all those clues, I had to come forward. Why the directorate didn't is something I can't fully explain. This particular statement puzzled the Foundation researcher, raising questions he hadn't anticipated. Only uniforms? Did this mean that the sub had been unmanned? The informant replied, No, not unmanned. There were no bodies, but personal effects were everywhere, along with uniforms. There was some blood, human. Before you ask, on one of the torpedoes and a bit of skin where somebody probably crushed his hand loading the thing. Just no bodies left. When I first looked into all this, I had no clue what the hell had gone on down there, but I started putting things together. The Foundation agent began to speculate based on the mounting evidence. Could it have been a Soviet weapons program? A deadly biological agent of some kind? No, it wasn't that. I thought maybe it could have been, so I dialed up some of my contacts at Biopreparant. Us spies wind up owing each other favors after a while, and they denied it vehemently. Not your usual cover-up baloney either. They clearly stated that whatever the sub was carrying, it wasn't theirs. They wanted no part of it. Sounded like he was gonna puke when I mentioned redacted. Doctor, do you have any idea what it takes to make a bioweapons researcher sick? Now that wasn't what really bugged me though. What really kept me awake at night was the KGB file that fell into our hands. They mention a covert op by the Soviet military against an internal unnamed faction to get rid of a, quote, terrifying weapons that even the Soviet Union can't safely control. They wanted to lose it, whatever it was, or maybe fob it off onto the US. Of course, that all came to light right before the Iron Curtain fell, and given the atmosphere at the time, it was practically impossible to convince the directors that they weren't talking about nukes, and even once I did, they still didn't even think this was worthy of action. I mean, the redacted would probably have me hanged for treason if they ever find me, but it was worth the risk. And by what I can gather, sounds like Russia thinks so too, loaning you half the Pacific Fleet and all. The interview continued after this point, but the rest of the conversation was considered irrelevant and stricken from the official file. The interview left the Foundation with more questions than answers, though they were more certain than ever that SCP-741 must be kept under strict containment procedures. Due to the object's location at the bottom of the sea, as well as the unusually elevated pressure around it, it is unlikely that many civilians will come into contact with it. However, as an extra protective measure, sonar and submersible monitoring is conducted on a periodic basis in order to verify that the wreckage has not been interfered with in any way. The Foundation contracted Russian warships, SCPs Basisty and Krasnoyarsk, has been selected for this purpose. If any unauthorized activity occurs in the area surrounding SCP-741, nuclear and conventional missiles may be deployed. Any movement of SCP-741 is grounds for an immediate nuclear strike. Whatever secrets SCP-741 holds, whatever it was transporting that was even more of an uncontrollable threat than nuclear warfare, they're better left alone down there, at the bottom of the sea.
This is impossible!
The SCP site director wasn't normally a calm or cheerful man, but the researcher had rarely seen him as angry as he was right now. His face turned a deep beet red as he scanned the documents on his desk before he asked how months of valuable research on this subject had suddenly gone blank. The data was completely gone. The researcher gulped nervously, hoping a demotion wasn't in his future, and nodded. How could this be possible? This was an experienced researcher who should have been taking all of the necessary precautions. Could the being they were studying somehow have erased all these documents himself? That's just what the researcher had been trying to find out for months, with hours and hours spent trying to learn the extent of its abilities.
Well, where are they?
The site director asked.
I want everything you have!
The researcher dropped a printout of their research on the mysterious subject's abilities on the director's desk. Every relevant line read, "Data lost." The director let out a deep sigh. He wanted to hear everything the researcher knew. Well, everything he could remember, at least, from the beginning. The researcher sat down and began to relay everything he could about SCP-343, which some of the other researchers had started to refer to by the nickname God. SCP-343 was first sighted in Prague, just an unassuming older man wandering the streets. He seemed completely normal to everyone who passed him by, until he decided he was tired of staying on the ground. An SCP agent stationed in the area noticed the old man disappear from the streets, as if he was blinking out of existence, only to appear on a rooftop nearby. The local SCP teams were marshaled, and they had soon tracked down what seemed to be a very powerful specimen. But SCP-343 didn't seem concerned. He reacted calmly when detained by the Foundation and went with them willingly. He was detained in a standard holding cell for interrogation and examination, but he seemed completely at ease with his sudden confinement. It would soon become clear that this ordinary old man was anything but. Drs. Beck and Nidlovu was brought in to consult on the SCP's classification, and that's when the first anomalies began. Their assessments matched initially, but when it came time to describe him physically, things took a strange turn. Older male, seemingly nondescript and with no unusual physical features. Caucasian in appearance. Dr. Nidlovu was confused by what Dr. Beck was describing in his report. This man was clearly black. The two doctors quarreled, unable to square their differing perceptions. They decided to bring in a third impartial view to settle it, their fellow researcher Dr. Wan. She didn't take long before coming back with her assessment. Older male, seemingly nondescript and with no unusual physical features, Asian in appearance, possibly Chinese. Whatever SCP-343 was, he seemed to be perceived by each staff member as close in appearance to their own race. But that was only the start of the anomalies surrounding the old man in the holding cell. Dr. Beck started making regular visits to the mysterious man, and in their first interview, he asked the old man who he was and how he came by his abilities. The old man had a simple response. "I created the universe." Dr. Beck stifled a laugh and decided to indulge the old man's delusion. It was a fascinating claim, but could he prove it? Without another word, SCP-343 got up from his chair, laughed, and turned around and walked through the solid wall in the holding cell and disappeared. Dr. Beck was about to hit the panic button and marshal the facility's security to find him when the strange man reappeared, walking through the solid wall. The only thing that was different? He was holding a hamburger, which he sat down and enjoyed. The facility quickly went on lockdown, and a full investigation was done into how SCP-343 breached containment. But there was no evidence of any security breach, no failures in containment, and no evidence of any other cells failing. SCP-343 hadn't broken through the security, he had just ignored it, as if it wasn't there at all. When questioned about how he had gone on his hamburger run, he simply repeated his belief that he was God, in between bites of his fast food treat. This would be far from the only time strange things happened around SCP-343. SCP containment cells are as secure as they need to be, but even the least strict containment isn't known for its decor, which is why Dr. Beck was in for a surprise the next time he paid visit to SCP-343. The bare-bones cell now looked like a comfortable home, decorated in Old English fashions. The scientists assumed that SCP-343 had been making many more trips out of his cell to get accessories to feel more at home. But that didn't explain all the changes to the cell. No one could explain how he had installed a roaring fireplace in the containment cell, and everyone who entered could swear the cell looked many times bigger than any other cell in the facility. SCP-343 wasn't just breaking containment. He now seemed to be breaking the laws of physics in the facility. The rules of the SCP containment facility didn't seem to be a concern to SCP-343, but there was one thing he didn't seem to want to do: escape. After every sudden exit, he would always return to his personal cell and treat it as his home. When interviewed by staff members, he was polite but vague, and everyone seemed to enjoy talking to him. It was decided to keep him on site, not attempt to increase his security, but restrict access and keep his room guarded at all times to ensure only researchers with level 3 access and above were allowed to meet with him. But God works in mysterious ways. Minimal Security Site-17 was one of the least restrictive SCP containment sites, hosting anomalies that could be safely contained and weren't likely to mount violent escapes. But as in every SCP facility, security was still taken seriously, and only those with proper clearance could interact with the subjects. So why did SCP-343 seem impossible to guard? While only level 3 clearance and above were allowed in, the guards assigned to protect the entrance all seemed to fall down on the job. Security Officer James, who was supposed to be keeping people out of SCP-343's cell, had instead let in multiple visitors, in addition to dropping in several times himself. When questioned on why he had gone against orders and done so, he simply replied that 343 seemed lonely and was so happy every time he got company that it just seemed like the right thing to do. The security guard was reassigned and new ones were brought in, but history repeated itself. Guards were given stricter instructions to minimize exposure, but SCP-343's presence always seemed to influence them anyway. His containment cell was a revolving door, with staff members at the facility entering regularly for friendly conversations. Dr. Beck decided it was time to take matters into his own hands. He would meet with SCP-343 one-on-one and express how dangerous these security breaches were. He would try to convince the mysterious being that he needed to stop influencing the minds of the guards watching him, or the facility would have to look into new measures to contain him. Dr. Beck entered the containment cell and had a long conversation with SCP-343, and when he emerged, he had a big smile on his face, like he had just finished a reunion with an old friend. He gave the current guard a friendly clap on the back and told him not to worry so much about security. After all, nothing bad was going to happen from letting people at the facility visit SCP-343, right? He wasn't dangerous in any way. He also said that security should bring him anything he requests so he would feel less need to leave his cell. Minimal Security Site-17 soon became a model SCP facility. with morale being the highest of any site, with most giving the credit to the presence of SCP-343. Employees generally make daily visits to his chamber, and he seems to have an encyclopedic knowledge of anything they want to talk about, including things he should have no way of knowing. Guards no longer quit their posts or break protocol, as their only real duty is to keep track of who meets with SCP-343, so they can be interviewed and debriefed after. Everyone's conversation is different, but they all report being in a better mood after leaving than when they came in. No further information is available on SCP-343's origins, the full extent of his powers, or whether he is telling the truth about being the god who created the universe. The site director rubbed his temples after hearing the researcher's explanation.
So what you're telling me is that we have an uncontained, highly powerful SCP that has not only been breaking containment whenever it wants, but has managed to destroy all the files regarding the research on it.
The researcher's answer was yes. However, the situation at Site-17 seemed to be stable, and they had come up with a plan that should help to maximize the positive effect SCP-343 has on the facility. They were even hypothesizing that staff from other sites and even certain anomalies could be pacified by 343's presence. The site director wasn't impressed though. He wanted the researcher to go back to the drawing board and redo the research. After all, if all the files were blank, how could they ever learn how to properly contain it? That's what the C and SCP stood for after all, containment. The researcher finally had to stand to the director though, and told them that it wasn't a good idea, that they had already tried everything to contain SCP-343, but that it wasn't that he broke containment. It was as if he didn't even acknowledge that an attempt had been made to contain him.
He was omnipotent, aware of things he shouldn't, and able to do things that broke the laws of physics without breaking a sweat.
There was no evidence that this was God, the creator of the universe as he claimed to be, but there also wasn't any evidence yet to conclusively prove he wasn't. The researcher's best guess was that this was a powerful reality bender whose abilities knew no limits, and that the only reason he was staying in the facility was because he wanted to, and doing anything to change that might cause him to change his benevolent ways. The director sighed. As much as he hated to admit it, his researcher was making good points. He wanted to meet SCP-343 personally, but did he need to know anything first?
Well, sir,
The researcher replied.
he likes hamburgers, but beyond that, he'll take care of the rest. He's right there where we left him,
In his home, waiting for his next guest.
Nothing in life can prepare you for the raw heat of a house on fire. Throwing an arm up in front of his eyes and clasping a handkerchief to his mouth, Robert Chetford hacked up half of the contents of his lungs. Glancing at the material, he saw that his phlegm was black, poisoned by the smoke. A beam collapsed in front of him, sending a fresh wave of burning air into his face, so hot that it felt like it was going to scorch his ears off. He had to run. He had to get out of the house, but he knew he couldn't. His mother was upstairs. Robert barreled his way through the flames, shouldering open doors and stumbling along hallways. The air was so thick with smoke that he could barely breathe, so he collapsed to the floor and started to crawl on his stomach. He reached the first step of the grand staircase and started to heave himself up one at a time, feeling the heat of the house threatening to engulf him more with every inch he climbed. But he hadn't made it more than 5 steps before there was an enormous creaking sound, and the whole staircase collapsed beneath him. Sparks rushed up into the air and swirled around the room. Flames licked at the walls all around him. As Robert looked around at the collapsed staircase, he knew that it was hopeless. With tears streaming down his cheeks, he pushed himself forward and ran out of the house. The firemen swarmed past him, filling the building and shouting to one another, but Robert just stood there, staring up at the top floor window. On the other side of the glass, surrounded by billowing smoke, he looked up at his mother, sitting as she always did on her rocking chair, utterly motionless as the house burned around her. In an undisclosed facility in the United States of America, you will find what may well be the lowest security containment cell in the entire SCP Foundation. There is no heavily armored door, no bulletproof glass, no machine guns about to drop down from the ceiling at any point. In fact, there's very little in the way of containment at all. They often leave the door to the cell wide open. There is a window, but on the other side of it isn't a crowd of researchers, security guards, and agents ready to spring into action at a moment's notice. It's just a normal double-glazed window that looks out across a vista of fields, trees, and a couple of power lines. Facing the window is an old armchair in which the concrete man sits, SCP-014. He spends all of his day, every day, staring out of the window. This view specifically was chosen because very little changes in it. Night turns to day, the trees change with the seasons, and it rains occasionally. But there are no roads, no new buildings springing up, nothing to distinguish it from how it looked in 1937. Beside him is a small table, home to a record player. In the corner of the room, there's an antique set of shelves that house 3 dozen old records, all dated from the 1930s or earlier. All day, every day, the music plays out of the old speaker. Every so often, as researchers walk up and down the corridor, if they hear that there isn't any music playing, they'll come into the room and change the record over for a new one. The newest researchers check in with SCP-014 to see if he's okay. He rarely responds, and so before long, they stop asking. You would think, therefore, that the concrete man is elderly, approaching the twilight years of his life, but the man who sits there in his chair, staring out of the window and listening to music from almost 100 years ago, appears to be just 30 years old. Friends of Robert Chetford reported a noticeable change in his demeanor following the fire and death of his mother. He had lost his father not long before to a workplace accident. William Chetford had been a construction worker, climbing up the girders of New York's emerging skyline, pouring concrete and piling bricks. He had been working on a new building, one that was said to be the tallest in the world, called the Empire State Building. Day after day, he would climb the cranes, teeter precariously over the dizzying drops. Any slight mistake, and he would plummet hundreds of feet, often to the busy streets below. Sure enough, one day William Chetford's worst fears came to life. He was walking on a gangplank that wobbled and bent with every step he took. On his shoulders was a metal bar with a bucket of concrete dangled precariously from each tip. He walked this route every day, but clearly, that day proved too much for the wood to take. The board splintered and split beneath him, plunging him down and down through the scaffolding. William desperately reached out an arm and managed to grasp the edge of a girder. He hung there helplessly, staring up at his colleagues high above him. He cried out for help, and upon seeing him, they began to scramble down level by level to try and rescue him. He just needed to hang on for a moment longer, and they would rescue him. But one of them knocked over a bucket of concrete. William Chetford could do nothing but watch as the heavy sludge slowly tumbled towards his face. He tried to dodge it, but it was no use. The company told Mrs. Chetford that this had been William's saving grace, that he had been unconscious for the long fall down to the streets below. His fellow workers knew that this wasn't the case. They heard his screams all the way down. Mrs. Chetford didn't believe any of it. They were lying, all of them. The company, his co-workers, everybody. She knew what had really killed him. It was the same thing that was killing her slowly, the same thing that had been passed on to their son, concrete poisoning. She'd approached the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, and any outlet she could, but none of them were remotely interested in the story. There were chemicals in the concrete. It wasn't safe to use. It never had been. She'd been working in nursing homes and seen the effects of concrete on construction workers. They'd become paralyzed, unable to move, spending so many years breathing concrete air, letting it absorb into their skin. Their bodies had slowly started to turn into it. She knew it. She started to go crazy, pinning up news clippings, medical journals, photographs, maps, anything she could find, all over her walls, her entire bedroom. She had red string hanging from the walls and ceiling, connecting to every surface. Robert watched helplessly from the doorway, unable to do anything as he saw his mother steadily entering into psychosis. But the further her paranoia went, the less energy she seemed to have for it. Weeks went by, and her manic fervor was replaced with lethargy. She got slower and slower in her movements, talked less and less at mealtimes, and began to sit down for extended chunks of the day. Robert, assuming that she was tired from grief, did what he could to help. He carried an armchair up to her room and placed it in the corner by the window so that she could look out over the world around her. He thought she was resting, but it soon became apparent that she wasn't really resting. She was withdrawing. almost freezing over. Desperate to try and get his mother to re-engage with the world, Robert sat down with her to try and understand all of her conspiracy theories around his father's death. She explained slowly and calmly that the concrete being used in New York was poisoned, cursed. She didn't know where it had been dug up from, how it had been mixed, or who was behind it, but she was getting close. Maybe it was the US government. Maybe it was the same witches. Maybe it was God himself. But she knew her husband, and she knew he wouldn't have fallen that day. He had walked across that plank thousands of times without incident. There was no way he would have made that mistake. Robert tried to connect the dots of what she was saying. Did she really think that it was the concrete that had killed his father? She said that it was, and that the same concrete is now killing her. She showed him her hands, turned them over front and back under the light for him to inspect. They looked just like normal hands, elderly, wrinkled, with deep veins popping out, but normal. She scratched at them and tried to feign pain for the effects of her fingers.
"Look," she said. "You see that powder coming off them? That's concrete powder."
But Robert didn't see any of it. The concrete man came to the Foundation's attention a couple decades ago. Construction workers in New York in the late 1990s were hard at work clearing out the foundations for a new skyscraper. The site was built on top of what used to be a residential block. But one intrepid builder soon discovered something that shook him to his core. There was an old cellar beneath where the building used to be. The lock on it was heavy, thick with rust, and had been open for close to 70 years. He and his team managed to pry it open, put on their flashlights, and went inside. What they found was a basement apartment still sitting there beneath the rubble. It was a relic of its time. Thick dust covered every surface, ugly wallpaper surrounded them, and ancient appliances covered with rust sat in the kitchen. It was almost like walking through a haunted house. The builders joked about ghosts stalking these corridors as they made their way through, until they reached the bedroom. Sliding the door open, they faced a man sitting there, staring at them from an old armchair. The four burly builders screamed like little girls for a split second, then burst out laughing when they realized that the man wasn't real. He must have been a waxwork or something. He was sitting so perfectly still and hadn't reacted at all to their presence. They went over to inspect what he was made out of. They tapped on his forehead, lifted his arms and dropped them, and were surprised at how convincing the fake man was. That was, of course, until he politely asked them not to touch him. This time, they really did scream like girls, running straight out of the basement into a local police station. This basement apartment was where Robert Chetford moved following the fire in his parents' home and the death of his paralyzed mother. Racked with guilt, he had never been quite able to process what had happened to cause his mother's mental state to deteriorate so rapidly. By the time she died, she had been looking at her hands and genuinely believed they were made of concrete. She would not move, she would not eat, she would not sleep. For days, she would just sit, staring out of her window. He knew he should have taken her to a doctor, but they just couldn't afford it. Maybe if he had, this would have all worked out differently. Robert would think about it hour after hour. He would sit down in the armchair in the corner of his room and ponder what had happened. It was difficult to keep track of time living in the basement. There were no windows, no daylight at all, but he didn't think he had been sitting there for very long when he noticed the skin on his hands starting to turn gray. Without panic, he slowly lifted his hands to his eyes and inspected what was happening. His fingers, down to about halfway through his palms, were dry and solid. He could move them just about, but it took a normal effort, and he could see cracks running along the back of the concrete when he did, so he decided not to. He wouldn't say he felt calm exactly, maybe disconnected. He didn't feel particularly hungry, he didn't feel particularly tired. In fact, he didn't feel much at all. His concrete limbs were only a passing curiosity to him as he sat in his chair. Very occasionally, he would get up to put on a record on his record player, then return to his seat and stare at the wall. That would be every couple of months at most. The rest of the time, he would just sit there. One day, he noticed in a vague corner of his mind that the ground was shaking and dust was filling the room. The ripping sound of dynamite and the heavy stone just above his head told him that the apartment block towering over him had fallen down and almost come through his ceiling. Robert just sat there, unconcerned. Another day, some indeterminate time later,
a group of builders came in dressed in peculiar, futuristic clothing, with bright yellow hats and reflective vests. They seemed rather startled to see him, though in truth he had little care for seeing them. What did perturb him was when a group of people claiming to be agents from the Foundation came into his room and carried him out. He didn't like the noise, didn't like the change. If he wanted to move, he would move. Not that he could, of course. He was now entirely made of concrete, but that was beside the point. These people put him in the back of a van and drove him across half of the United States. They wheeled him through brightly lit rooms and into a disgusting modern white box. They had done the courtesy of bringing his chair along and found a new record player for him, with a whole selection of albums lining a shelf on the wall. He would have appreciated it and said thank you to them, but he didn't really care. He wasn't present at all. This was, of course, due to the fact that he was made of concrete by this point. However, once he was sat in his chair and took in the sight in front of him, Robert Chetford felt a dull panic rising in his chest. They placed him at a window, just like he'd placed his dying mother in front of a window. He tried to clench his jaw, tried to move his hands, tried to cry out in fear and pain, but he couldn't. He was paralyzed. The smell of smoke filled his chest, choking him, torturing him as the memories of his burning household raged in his mind. He tried to scream, he tried to fight, he tried to do anything other than just sit there, but it was far too late for any of that. "Good afternoon, Mr. Chetford," the researcher said, busying herself and putting on another album for him to listen to. "Is there anything I can do for you, sir? Anything I can do to make you more comfortable?" The concrete man said nothing. The researcher patted him on the back of his hand. "Made of concrete indeed. Looks just like regular skin to me, Mr. Chetford. I do wonder what's going on inside that head of yours." On her way out of the room, she glanced at his view from the window. Beautiful weather outside today, isn't it? Scorching even.
Some say that SCP-2102 was a mistake, an abomination created by an accident of medical science. Maybe those people are right. Maybe there's much more to it than that. Either way, they don't know the full story. How could they? They weren't there. They weren't there all the way back in 1972. But Dr. Pavel Zukal was. The earliest moments, the events that directly preceded SCP-2102's creation began on March 2nd. The wind was carrying an unforgiving, freezing bite with it as Zukal made his way to the Institute of Experimental Medicine, ZISAV, in Czechoslovakia. With the Cold War between the USSR and the United States underway, there was already an air of secrecy on both sides. Espionage and intelligence-gathering operations were rampant, bringing with them paranoia and distrust. There was no way of knowing if someone was a double agent, leaking information to the West. But while the governments of Russia, America, and their various respective allies and enemies scrambled for control and amassed obscene quantities of nuclear arms in secret, there were even more cogs turning, hidden in the deepest, darkest shadows. The SCP Foundation's long-standing rivalry with various other groups of interest was well known among any with a high enough security clearance. Most of these groups were radicals or outliers, despite possessing knowledge of anomalies or even being directly linked to them. A lot of GOIs were independent of any world government. But for decades, the Foundation had been aware of a directly competing establishment, effectively a parallel of their own organization on the other side of the globe. They were known as GRU Division P, a USSR equivalent of the SCP Foundation themselves. It is unclear based on what was recovered from Dr. Zukal's personal diary if he had been directly scouted by GRU Division P for their project in Czechoslovakia. Given the air of secrecy engulfing the USSR at the time, it is possible that Pavel himself had no inclination that Division P was even involved in the project, due to take place at the Institute of Experimental Medicine. He might have suspected, but with no way of knowing for sure. Similarly, there was no way Zukal could have known where the project would lead, what he would have a hand in creating. The initial few weeks after his arrival at the Institute were rocky, to say the least. Zukal, along with a team of scientists and technicians working on orders direct from Moscow, had to contend with unreliable equipment and difficulty getting electricity to power the project. Eventually, after clearing those initial hurdles, testing could begin. But what was the goal of this mysterious project? Well, through Zukal, GRU Division P and the Kremlin were chasing something the scientific world has been trying to accomplish for decades.
something that could change the very landscape of not only the Cold War, but the entirety of modern medicine, the secrets of cellular regeneration. Unlocking that would, in theory, enable them to create the world's very first unkillable super soldier. And hey, it definitely wouldn't be the craziest secret operation carried out by a world superpower during the Cold War. The CIA spent millions turning a cat into a listening device and training it to infiltrate enemy headquarters. This so-called acoustic kitty was struck and killed by a random van during its first mission. Compared to that, a cell-regenerating super soldier was positively sensible. With a worldwide nuclear arms race already underway, perhaps the project's ultimate goal was to produce an entire army of these self-regenerating troops. With something like that in their hands, the USSR would have the manpower to reinforce their nuclear arsenal, and potentially even soldiers capable of surviving and healing from the effects of an atomic blast. On the 5th of May 1972, the first of the project's human test subjects began to show promising results. They underwent physical trauma at the hands of Zukal and the other scientists, only for their bodies to react much faster than the ordinary healing process would allow. Rapid clotting took place in the affected areas, preventing the subjects from bleeding out. However, this quickly went awry. The clots turned into severe lesions. Realizing this had occurred thanks to Macaulay, one of the other project scientists administering too much neodymium, Zukal chastised his colleague, vowing him to drag him to Moscow personally if another mistake like that ever took place again. Unfortunately, by the last few days of June, Dr. Zukal and his team were no closer to success. Every subject that underwent testing succumbed to the same necrosis. Reducing the amount of neodymium had only made the reaction worse, something Pavel couldn't allow Macaulay to know without the risk of it being held over his head for the remainder of the project. In every instance, the doctors were able to trigger rapid cell division, 50 times faster than that which occurs in the ordinary healing process of human beings. But the biggest drawback was that this division would quickly become uncontrollable. It was creating enough new matter on a cellular level that it would choke each test subject in its own excess waste. As you might expect, Dr. Zukal noted this in his diary that this process wasn't a pretty sight. Come mid-August 1972, the project scientists decided they needed a test subject with more resilience than the average person, and a suitable candidate was provided. He was a counter-revolutionary who had been sentenced to 15 years in a uranium mine as a punishment detail. Despite such an extended period of time under the harsh conditions of the mine and the close proximity to a radioactive element such as uranium, the man managed to survive unscathed. Upon closer examination, this new guinea pig, referred to as X16, had a rate of healing twice as fast as that of an average man. Perhaps it was a random genetic abnormality that made X16 this way, or maybe it was a result of his extensive time in the uranium mines. Either way, it made him the perfect new subject for Zukal's experiments. Initially, subject X16's preliminary testing results looked promising. The wound healing process was actually taking place now, instead of resulting in necrosis or aborting it as it had with the earlier experiments. In fact, Dr. Zukal seemed to think X16 was healing almost too quickly. But nevertheless, testing continued, although not without a different type of problem. The questionable morality of what they were doing began to set in for Pavel, causing him nights of endless tossing and turning, unable to sleep as he reflected on what he'd done. X16 had managed to survive for much longer than the earlier test subjects, but it was clear that the torture this man had to endure was exacting a heavy toll. Every day, the doctors would lacerate him, time and time again, recording the results. And every day, he survived, only for the cycle to begin again the next day. For his own part, Zukal was conflicted. On the one hand, the results of the testing were proving successful, lasting far longer and working far more effectively than they had in the past, and yet on the other, it came at the cost of one man's continued suffering. To make matters worse, Pavel had no way of voicing his concerns to any of his team. Any questioning of his orders or the project's methods would have been viewed by GRU Division P and the KGB as sedition and treason, earning the good doctor a one-way ticket to a gulag, or, if he was lucky, a clean shot to the back of the head from an agent's pistol. Often morality is sacrificed for the greater good, in the pursuit of the advancement of science or a nation's goals. But now that the project was showing results with X16, now that it was real, what they were doing still weighed heavily on Dr. Zukal's conscience. Then, on October 15, 1972, the final piece of the puzzle seemed to become clear. By introducing the correct amount of stabilizing agent into the serum they had concocted, Zukal and his team had perfected the composition. Upon administering this newly completed version of the solution, the doctor noted in his diary that subject X16 was responding well. At least, medically, the subject was responding well. It was clear that the continuous experimentation he had been subjected to was causing uncooperative behavior in X16. But so close to the cusp of achieving the project's goals, Dr. Zukal was quick to cast aside his previous doubts about the ethics of their methods. They were so close to victory, so close to the project being over, that it no longer mattered how cooperative X16 was being. But 2 weeks and 4 days later, just as the project was nearing its end goal, disaster struck. MU Dr. Elena Orakova was one of the scientists on Zukal's team, who had primarily helped when examining the early cell divisions, those that were leading to necrosis and causing test subjects to produce too much excessive genetic material. Elena had made a startling discovery and immediately brought it to Dr. Zukal in a distraught show of panic. The cell samples they had used to test their serum were now gaining mass, seemingly from nowhere. Just like the earlier experiments, the effects were working almost too well, causing an overabundance of cellular regeneration to the point where the cells couldn't stop producing masses of waste genetic material. When Zukal brought Elena's findings to Drs. Sislard and one Georgi T. Fedinko, the project heads assigned by Division P, they were quick to disregard it as an error, determining to press on with the project to meet their deadline. Over the course of the following weeks, up to late November, Zukal was trying to determine what was causing this change. It was clear that unless he and Elena could resolve the issues with the serum, subject X16 would be a total failure. But time was running out, with their superiors at GRU Division P and the Kremlin expecting results by early December. Under untold amounts of pressure and subsequent stress, Dr. Pavel Zukal found himself losing time, unable to sleep to the point where he was drifting off whenever he was on the verge of a breakthrough. By the end, Elena was the only member of the team trying to help him methodically figure out what had gone wrong. The deadline for the project arrived on December 2nd, 1972. Pavel didn't sleep all night leading up to it, knowing he would have to present a functioning super soldier to GRU Division P. In the best case, he was risking being accused of negligent failure, forced to restart the project from scratch, making his months of hard work redundant. But worst case scenario, Zukal could be charged with treason for having not completed the task he was selected for. On the 2nd of December, he wrote, "I really don't know which is better. Tomorrow is a day too." Nobody knows if Dr. Pavel Zukal lived to see that tomorrow. His final diary entry was made on the day SCP-2102 was born. For months, the SCP Foundation had operatives embedded within the Czechoslovakian government as part of innumerable Cold War espionage gathering efforts. During that time, their agents had gathered enough intelligence to make the Foundation aware of a GRU Division P project based at the Institute of Experimental Medicine, and that the scientists there were looking to unlock the secret of rapid cellular regeneration. Someone, possibly even one of Zukal's team, had managed to infiltrate the project and had leaked documents to the SCP Foundation, explaining what was going on in Czechoslovakia. The plan was that the Foundation would move in secret of course, to extract and contain test subject X16 in January of 1973. That day would never come to fruition though. On the 2nd of December, only a month before they had planned to act, the Foundation became aware of a catastrophe occurring at the Institute of Experimental Medicine. One of their agents in Czechoslovakia alerted them to a disturbance that had caused civilians and scientists alike to run from the institute in fear for their lives. Something had gotten loose, and the Foundation had to act fast. Luckily, a reconnaissance team was stationed in Eastern Europe. Members of various mobile task forces who had been spying on GRU Division P and the rest of the USSR. Moving quickly, the recon team was deployed to Czechoslovakia. Led by a field commander named Merrick, they were given the objective to determine the cause of the situation and, if possible, recover its anomalous source. Merrick and the recon team arrived on site at the Institute's grounds. The entrance to the bunker which had been housing the project was left wide open, with not a soul in sight. As the team progressed further, Merrick couldn't help but notice a pungent smell permeating the labs and offices that they passed. Foundation Command urged their operatives to proceed cautiously and recover any paperwork they could. Among the logistical documents was a diary belonging to one of the scientists, although the name Pavel Zukal on the cover was no longer legible, forever lost. The further he and the other MTF agents progressed, the worse the smell got. They located an elevator, deciding to take it down to the lower levels of the bunker. One by one, the team filed in, Merrick radioing command. "Command, any seismic activity in the area?" he asked. Not that we know of, Merrick," came the Foundation's reply. "Why?" I think I just felt something move down there." The elevator had barely descended a foot before it hit something, stopping in an instant. As Merrick tried once again to contact Foundation Command, that same something came tearing through the elevator floor. Over the radio, the SCP Foundation were treated to a cacophony of screeching, tearing metal, along with the screams of their own men. What Merrick and his team had encountered may have once been a man, perhaps someone subjected to cruelty and torture, but now all they saw was an amorphous, fleshy mass. Immediately, the recon team opened fire, engaging what they assumed was a raging monster. It probably never occurred to them that they might have just wanted to be free after years of imprisonment, followed by months of horrendous experiments. Minutes later, Merrick was able to get in contact with Command again, locked in a heated battle with the entity. But every round fired, every shot their guns landed, nothing was having any effect. Whenever Merrick dealt damage to the creature, part of it seemed to grow, faster and faster each time. Their guns were useless, unable to stop the expanding monstrous test subject. Even grenades thrown by the MTF operatives, causing multiple explosions, did little to stop the entity in its tracks. Listening in over the radio, knowing they had few options left, the SCP Foundation dispatched a pair of F-4 Phantoms, long-range supersonic fighter jets, equipped with a payload of M47A1 napalm incendiary bombs. With Merrick and his men almost on the ropes, Command issued an order to retreat. They fled the bunker, only to feel the ground shake beneath their feet. The monster had breached the topsoil, still coming after them. Jones, one of the Foundation's agents, was pulled under the encroaching shapeless mass, crushed to death as it continued its pursuit. Utterly horrified at the sight and speed of the creature, Merrick started begging Command over the radio to get its fighter jets to the scene. 6 minutes later, the sound of twin turbine engines shot through the air, followed by the whistle of bombs careening down towards the ground. In a second, Merrick, his team, and the creature were engulfed in a fiery explosion, the heat proving enough to cauterize the fleshy abomination's expanding tissue. Ever since December 1972, the entity now designated as SCP-2102 has been housed at Site-122, contained by the SCP Foundation. They keep it in a modified cell, restrained at all times with its hands and feet in padded sleeves. This is done in order to prevent the risk of injury, either accidental or intentional, given both SCP-2102's anomalous properties and its self-destructive tendencies. Its body is covered in scars, both from its previous escape attempts, back when it was known as Subject X-16, and from burns from the F-4 Phantom's napalm payload. These particular injuries seared the entity's ears, mouth, and eyes closed, rendering it deaf, mute, and blind. If SCP-2102 ever suffers any form of external injury, its anomalous properties will trigger. The creature, as you might have guessed, possessed an advanced form of cellular healing, able to regenerate from all wounds inflicted on it. However, the process was never perfected. It still works too well, so well that SCP-2102's cells don't know when to stop. Instead, they continue producing bodily tissue, expanding its mass into every available space without a halt. The process can be slowed if an obstacle is introduced, boxing in the exponentially growing tissue. However, any object or person in its path is eventually crushed under the mounting pressure. At present, the Foundation still has no idea how much SCP-2102's tissue could expand, potentially even posing a risk to the entire world if left unchecked. There is only one surefire way to stop the creature's healing. It can only be halted by cauterizing the open wound with intense heat. It's literally a surefire solution. SCP-2102 is a result of the good Dr. Zukal's work, combined with his and GRU Division P's willingness to put aside their morality. They didn't create an undying, regenerating super soldier for the USSR as they had intended. Instead, all they accomplished was turning a tortured man into a monster, an abomination endlessly tormented by the experiments performed on him. Not quite as useful on the battlefield, is it?
Are you afraid of haunted houses? What about haunted castles, or prisons, or mental asylums? We've all seen or heard tales of terrible tortured souls walking down long and lonely hallways, looking for people to pass their ancient pain onto. But what about something a lot more subtle? Perhaps as humble and unassuming as a cozy little woodshed. An adventurer named Kate would find that sometimes terrible things hide in simple places. With every step, twigs broke under the sole of her boot, their snaps echoing around the emptiness of the surrounding forest. Birds cawed down at her from their perches up above, a grave omen, a warning not to tread further. Well, at least to anyone who actually bought into all that superstitious stuff. Kat was far from a believer in that sort of thing, although at the same time, she had more than a passing interest in all things occult and unnatural. For her, it was less about the actual practice of certain things. The appeal was more about the stories that those practices inspired. Legends and myths, spooky tales of ghosts, or the dead rising from their graves, and of course, the magical mother of them all, witchcraft. Although her fascination with the inexplicable and macabre rarely, if ever, overlapped with her other big passion, hiking. Until, of course, today. She could trek anywhere and wanted to aim for everywhere, through sprawling national parks filled with vibrant greenery, up the sides of mountains, climbing up to the peaks, to across deserts, following the almost empty highways to get from one tiny rural town to the next. There was something about getting to not just know about the world, but to actively go and see it with her own two eyes, to actually be out there in it. That felt so right. On her current journey, Kate had taken herself on a long trail through the heart of the American Midwest, lugging a heavy pack over her shoulders, filled with her tent, sleeping bag, outdoor cooking supplies, and all manner of camping gear. She had set off following the winding path of the Patoka River, which ran around or adjacent to a few of the major cities in the state of Indiana. Kate was hoping to follow the flow of its main body of water all the way through to the city of Jasper. From there, it would be a straight shot over to the similarly named Patoka Lake, and after she had walked around the entire circumference of that, it would be a long hike east towards West Virginia, home of the Blue Ridge Mountains. Sure, it was one hell of an ambitious trip for one person traveling alone, but Kate liked to keep her journeys unencumbered. Having someone else coming with her would just slow her down, or they wouldn't be able to keep up with her at all. There's no fun at all in that. Stopping for the night, Kate lit herself a campfire. She had to make sure to keep it far enough from the trees to avoid starting any potential catastrophes, but also not too close to the wet bank of the Patoka, otherwise her kindling wouldn't catch alight. There were so many variables to consider for any aspiring camper. Sparks from the flint that she always took on her travels struck the dry twigs she had collected, and soon a gentle orange glow and wave of low heat were radiating from it. The fire provided Kate with just enough light to unfold and peg down her tent as the diminishing visibility of the dusk gave way to the encroaching nighttime darkness. Before getting comfortable in her sleeping bag, she put out her campfire using water from the Patoka, then zipped up the front of her tent, keeping a flimsy cloth barrier between herself and the local wildlife. Not everyone found it easy to sleep in the woods as Kate did. She couldn't remember a time when the noise of breaking twigs or the sounds of movement outside had ever kept her awake. Even now, the rustle of leaves and branches did little to disturb her, regardless of whether it was just the wind or something else moving through the bushes. Woken up by the sun rising, its warm light breaking through the trees, Kate readied herself to leave. She never stopped at the same place for more than one night, and rarely slept for any longer than she needed to. A nice 8-hour recharge of her energy reserves, and then it was back to the open road. After a quick breakfast, she packed up her single-person campsite, folded up her tent, and stuffed it back into her bag. Kate had been just about to leave when she noticed something was missing. Her compass. It had been in her backpack, which she kept in the tent with her all night. Quickly scanning the ground around her, she couldn't see it. Weird, but she figured she had obviously dropped it at some point during her hike and would have to pick up a new one when she got to Jasper. It didn't matter.
She could just follow the Patoka River as planned, although it didn't quite sit easy with her the rest of the day's trek. She'd packed the compass. That she was absolutely certain of. After all, she knew it wasn't like her to leave it behind. But then again, could she have forgotten it entirely? Over the next few hours, the question went round and round in Kate's head. As she walked along the bank of the river, silently starting to doubt herself, she drifted a little deeper into the woods, until out of the corner of her eye, she spotted something standing among the trees. It wasn't an animal or even a figure, but a structure. Spending so much time out in nature, anything man-made usually stuck out as an obvious, unignorable eyesore to Kate. She looked at it from a distance. It looked like an old house, isolated out in the woods, a short walk from the Patoka River. Checking the sky over her shoulder, Kate noticed it was getting late again, the daylight having gradually lowered while she had been wondering about why she had left her compass behind, or if it had been taken. Deciding to set up camp closer to the little house, she turned and headed in to inspect it closer. The place was far from the lap of modern luxury. Not that Kate couldn't live without running water or electricity for long stints of time, but it wasn't a house that had been built recently. Although she was no expert in either archaeology or architecture, Kate didn't think anyone had lived there for decades, possibly even centuries. It was almost medieval, a single room that was completely ramshackle, practically falling apart at the seams. Everywhere she looked, the wood that had originally been used to build it was either rotting away or had been broken into splintered remains. Plants from the forest had started growing through the floors and the walls, as if nature was trying to reclaim this spot of land where someone had once come to get away from the rest of the world. Sighing, Kat shook her head as she looked at the dilapidated house. There was no way even she could sleep there. It was too much of a safety risk. Parts of the ceiling could easily fall on her during the night if the wind picked up enough. Turning to leave, she stopped in her tracks as she noticed another structure, much smaller, behind the house. It had been so dwarfed in size by the slightly bigger building that it was completely obscured from view, but it looked to be in much better shape in terms of its structural integrity. It was a woodshed, its front door hanging lazily open. While not exactly brand new by anyone's standards, it was at least far more intact than the main house. Taking a few steps forward, Kate felt something like glass crunch under the heel of her boot. She scanned the floor, instinctively checking for any more so as to not injure herself. Even with the low amount of sunlight fading ever rapidly, it didn't look like more. Kicking her boot to loosen the shard, she made her way towards the woodshed, not noticing that what she'd been standing on had been a compass. Reaching the shed, she peered inside. It was pitch black within, almost as dark as the rest of the forest would be in a few minutes. Taking off her backpack and setting it down, she searched inside for her flashlight. Retrieving it and flipping on the switch, she looked back into the shed, and that was when she saw it. Taking a step back, Kat tripped over her bag, scrambling back up to her feet to make sure she had seen what she thought she had. It was just lying there, still and lifeless. For a split second, she hoped it was a trick of the light, just an old decaying lump of wood, but it wasn't. It was a body. The remains were charred, reduced to little more than bones some time ago. Even the ground next to it looked like it had been scorched, blackened by some intense fire damage. Kate's eyes were so transfixed on the burned mass of bones that a sudden sound startled her. Thunder growled above, immediately telling her she had little choice in what to do next. Her options were either she could sleep outdoors and get drenched by the rain and possibly catch hypothermia from being cold and wet, or she could spend a night in the cramped confines of this woodshed, which she would have to share with a long-dead body. Walking back outside to retrieve her bag, she pulled out a ground sheet and used it to cover up the bones. It was a mostly sleepless night, and those were a rarity for Kate. Any sleep she did get was light, easily interrupted by as little as her own movements, and offered her no actual rest. But for the next few hours, she just lay awake on the wooden floor. It wasn't the sounds of rain drumming against the shed's ceiling, or the booming of thunderclaps that were keeping her awake. Thoughts of what she was going to do about the bones kept coming to the forefront of Kate's mind. Should she report it to the police when she got to Jasper? Was there even any point if she had no idea where on the map this abandoned place was? Frustrated, she tossed and turned, eventually sitting up as something made a sound. It was a low, creaking, rusty metal hinge, screeching for a lack of any oiling over the years. The door was open. swinging lazily in the decreasing winds, its lock having long since broken. Grumbling to herself, Kate reached for an old shovel that had been left in the shed and went to grab the open door. As her head poked out from the shed, she looked around. It was the middle of the night, nothing to be seen anywhere around. Yet, she couldn't escape the feeling she was being watched. Taking the shovel, she jammed it underneath the doorframe, keeping it closed. At last, there was quiet. Maybe now she'd be able to get some much-needed sleep, and she did. But that's when the nightmare started. The dream was bizarre, unlike anything Kate had ever experienced before. She instantly recognized the warm, flickering orange glow of a large fire before her. Naturally, she started to pace her way towards it, the fire's heat washing over her the closer she got. But as she approached, Kate noticed something moving amongst the flames. Arms flailed, trying desperately to extinguish the blaze, legs kicking and writhing, and that was on top of the screaming. Another figure was standing facing the bonfire, their back to Kate as she walked closer still. With every step, the sounds of insects buzzing could be heard getting louder and louder. But it wasn't until she stepped near enough that she saw where the noise was coming from. A swarm of bugs was darting through the air, hovering around the other figure. There were enough of the insects that they formed what looked like a cloak, every part of it moving and buzzing of its own accord. The whole nightmare was so vivid, Kate had no idea if it had been brought on by her exhaustion or that her mind was still fixated on the bones she'd found in the woodshed. Dehydration, lack of food, or even some other influence. It could have been any one of those factors that had caused her to dream a dream like this, or a combination of all of them. Nonetheless, she could feel the bugs tapping at her skin as she walked up to the other figure, still unable to see them clearly. The noise of insect wings whizzed past her ears louder than ever, loud enough to be real. Putting a hand on the figure's shoulder, Kate turned them around. It was a woman, or what was left of her. She had huge gaping wounds left by something that had been cruelly buried in her face. Yet somehow, she was still standing, dead but also alive at the same time. The swarm of bugs around her moved with her body as she turned and faced Kate, a pair of glassy eyes staring at her. They were both blank, completely empty, each one missing its pupil. Opening her mouth, the woman let out a piercing, blood-curdling shriek. All around her, the sound of the bugs got louder, almost deafening, and as she screamed, so did Kate. Panting and shuddering, she bolted upright, shock racking her entire body, heart thudding against her ribcage. Instantly, the exact moment she woke up, Kate realized that feeling was back. She had spent so much of her time hiking through the woods on her own that she could tell when someone was watching her. In the dark, she fumbled for her flashlight and clicked it on to reveal the door was still jammed shut. Apart from her, there was no one else inside the shed, no one alive at least. Looking over her shoulder, she could see the bones behind her and immediately backed away from them, as far as she could in that tiny wooden hut. She had covered them before going to bed, she was certain of it, hadn't she? All of a sudden, Kate felt her skin start to itch, an intense, irritating feeling. She had experienced the effects of poison ivy and all sorts of plants that caused similar reactions, but this was easily 1,000 times worse. Her skin felt like it was burning. She scraped her fingernails down her exposed arm, trying to suppress the itching even for a moment, but it did nothing. She scratched at the other arm over and over again in one spot until her flesh was pink and raw. Still no change. Kate raked her nails over her own body, this time leaving a deep scratch trailing over her arm. Under the light of her torch, she'd realized that she'd drawn blood. She looked back at the bones in the scorched corner of the shed. The skull was facing straight towards her, hollowed-out eye sockets staring as empty as the pupilless eyes of the woman in her nightmare. It had done this. It must have done, she thought. Reaching towards the door, dropping her flashlight, she wrenched the shovel out from where she used it to wedge the entrance closed. She stood up, kicking her sleeping bag and backpack to the side. As hard as she could, desperate to make the itching stop, Kate brought the shovel downwards. The head of it snapped the already weakened floorboards of the shed, exposing the soft, dry earth beneath. Maybe if she buried those charred remains, whatever was happening to her would stop. Frantically, she started digging, hurling shovelfuls of dirt through the shed door. It listed further open, creaking loudly on its rusted hinges again, causing Kate to turn, startled at the sound of it knocking against the outer wall of the shed. Someone was looking right at her. She could feel it as real and as persistent as the itching feeling that crawled over her skin like the tiny legs of an army of insects. She dug further, eventually throwing the shovel to one side and dragging her hands through the exposed earth below, desperately burrowing through and only stopping to use any rock she found to try and stop the itch. All she achieved was drawing more blood. Her fingers touched something soft but solid, and Kate brushed away to clear more of the excess dirt, trying to uncover whatever it was. It felt like a long mass just beneath the ground, with a second similar object parallel to it. But the further along with it she reached, the quicker she realized what it was. A leg. Clearing more of the dirt higher up, Kate could feel more. A stomach, ribs, shoulders, and a head. Reaching for her flashlight buried under some of the dirt that had been dug up, she pointed it at the thing she'd found. The woman, the same one from her nightmare. Something inside her chest moved, scratching sharply, causing Kate to cough. And once she started, she couldn't stop. It was like the itching she'd felt on the outside had now worked its way inside, and it was spreading. No, moving. In fact, not just moving, but crawling. Through her lungs, burrowing down into her stomach, and at the same time, upwards. The clawing of tiny legs digging their way up her windpipe, blocking it. Kate couldn't breathe. She dropped to her knees, retching as she struggled for air, sputtering as she felt something move at the back of her throat. That was when she heard the buzzing again. Locusts. A swarm of them came spilling out of Kate's mouth. She couldn't scream, let alone catch her breath. They filled the shed in seconds, engulfing her entire body, as more and more of the desert bugs still came pouring from her mouth. Outside, the wind kicked up again, with enough force to blow the door to the woodshed closed, trapping Kate inside with the bugs that tore at her. There was a single word on the wooden surface of the door, written in deep black charcoal. She'd missed it. The door had been open when she found the shed. The word was witch. The SCP Foundation would later find this cursed cabin and would naturally lose a number of D classes to a horrific form of locust-based suffocation. While there are clues as to what exactly is going on in this terrible place, from the malice of a long-dead sorceress to the lingering revenge of a woman wrongfully persecuted, definite answers as to the anomalous mechanisms of the shed known as SCP-4595 still elude even the Foundation's finest minds. It's a place so mysterious and dangerous that the special containment procedures read, "For safety purposes, no personnel are permitted to enter SCP-4595. SCP-4595 should only be entered by authorized testing personnel under the supervision of the SCP-4595 Research Lead. Under no circumstances is SCP-4595-A to be disturbed in any way." So perhaps we'll never truly know why a humble wooden shed in Jasper, Indiana causes such horrifying effects for its victims. The SCP Foundation thinks it's safer to just lock it away and forget about it, letting its ancient wood and old bones rot in the dark. But if you are really curious about the truth, you can always take a walk down the side of the Patoka River and pay the witch a visit. If you're lucky, you might even get to leave.
Rock, paper, scissors. A simple hand game dating back to the Han Dynasty of Imperial China. It is a decisive game between two players, with the only outcomes being win, lose, or draw. We're quite familiar with rock, paper, scissors here at the SCP Foundation, as the guards are often seen playing intense rounds of the game to determine who will be the unlucky soul chosen to secure one of the various Keter-class SCPs during a given week. In most cases, this use of rock, paper, scissors is accepted as a largely harmless and fair way for defensive personnel to arrange their shifts. The reason for this is that the results of rock, paper, scissors are generally random, as there are very few ways for an individual's skill to influence the game. Or so one might think. In reality, rock, paper, scissors is a deeply psychological game, and this is mainly because of its origin as a contest between fellow human beings. The average human is vulnerable to making errors and falling into patterns, and with only 3 options to keep track of, it is entirely possible for a seasoned veteran of rock, paper, scissors to predict their opponent's choice before any hands are thrown. Of course, that opponent may also commit an error of their own by misreading the other player's actions, and thus there is always a chance for an impulsive decision to swing the results of the game in either direction. Human limitation is the only skill-based mechanic in the game of rock, paper, scissors, and that same limitation is what, in the eyes of some, holds the game back from reaching its true potential.
That was the case until someone out there discovered the rules to an anomalous version of rock, paper, scissors being spread through a mysterious email. While all attempts to trace the email back to its original sender have left the Foundation with more questions than answers, we have been able to learn more about the differences between the rules of standard rock, paper, scissors and the anomalous version. We have given this anomalous version of rock, paper, scissors the designation SCP-4633, and unlike the Classic Edition, under no circumstances are any Foundation personnel allowed to play a game incorporating any of the alternative rules. While the ceiling for skill and variety is theoretically much higher in a rock, paper, scissors match featuring SCP-4633, the risks to the player far outweigh any added novelty. Here is how SCP-4633 functions during an average game of rock, paper, scissors. Well, average prior to the anomalous properties taking effect. Rather than being limited to using merely rock, paper, or scissors, as the name of the game implies, the players gain access to a series of additional hand gestures, which upon the act of being thrown become seamlessly integrated into both players' shared understanding of the rules. This alone would be bizarre enough, but the true harm caused by SCP-4633 is in the nature of the gestures themselves. When one of the non-standard gestures allowed by SCP-4633 is used, the player's hands will change shape in ways that, under normal circumstances, would be anatomically impossible. Each of these non-standard gestures is distinct from the rest, with the only commonality being an unusual tendency for the final gesture to resemble biological structures often seen in sea life. One particular gesture might cause a player to rapidly grow a ring of additional fingers surrounding a gaping anemone-like mouth in the palm, while another could result in the player's entire arm flattening into a fin-like appendage. Regardless of how severe a departure from a typical human limb the final gesture would be, the limbs, and on rare occasions the entire body, of the player using the gesture will quickly and irreversibly mutate into the shape required to successfully perform it. While these gestures overwhelmingly result in forms that would be distressing to most people, the same cognitive effect that causes the participants to accept changes to the rules also appears to apply to the changes affecting their own bodies. To the players of an SCP-4633 augmented match of rock, paper, scissors, the non-standard gestures seem as mundane as the original three. Unfortunately, the morphic properties of SCP-4633 are practically irreversible, with extreme reconstructive surgery being required in even the best of cases. In all instances of SCP-4633, surgical intervention is necessary to prevent the spread of details regarding the non-standard gestures and their usage. Because of the immediate shift in cognitive awareness among participants, all that is needed for a new instance of SCP-4633 to occur is the faintest hint of knowledge of the alternative rules. It's even been noted that between different groups of players, the non-standard gestures can vary heavily or seemingly be created on the fly as the desire to win at all costs takes hold. Here are a few examples of anomalous gestures which have been observed during instances of SCP-4633. This list is by no means comprehensive, but it will provide an insight into how SCP-4633 drastically alters the existing mechanics of the game, as well as the physique of the players. The Thoriley gesture transforms the user's fingers into barbed tentacles. It beats paper and scissors but loses to rock. Chavoaga folds the fingers of the hand into the palm and causes them to emerge through the back of the palm. It allows the user to throw a second gesture after they've seen their opponent's choice. Ashkelhaz splits the hand into a pair of poisonous stingers, which also produce a potent electrical current between them. It has been seen to lose to paper, but seemingly of their own will, the stingers lashed at the opposing player and caused them to fall unconscious 3 rounds later due to the effects of the poison. Shausa beats paper and 2 other anomalous gestures, loses to scissors, rock, and a third gesture, and morphs the user's arm into a dactyl club similar to the front appendage of a mantis shrimp. Izurgov simply causes the player to grow 3 additional thumbs on one hand. The final gesture resembles a triple thumbs up. Izurgov has not been seen to beat any gestures, and the player who uses it always seems to go on to lose the match. Pagakmar causes the middle and ring to recede into the hand, while the pointer and pinky fingers extend to resemble the eye stalks of a snail or slug. The The rest of the hand also becomes coated in a thin layer of slime which continues to secrete from within. Pagakmar beats scissors and paper, but loses to rock and another anomalous gesture known as Vayanjek. Incidentally, Vayanjek causes the arm of the player using it to elongate into a worm-like tube that periodically spews a gout of salt water on the opponent. When Vayanjek was seen beating Pagakmar, the saltwater appeared to have some adverse effect on the latter gesture, causing the eye stalks to droop and the hand to shrivel until it was half its original size. Another anomalous gesture is Grazathrog, recognized by the skin, muscle, and veins of the hand turning translucent, revealing a pulsing red organ in the interior of the palm. Once Grazathrog has been thrown, the player who used it may call out the name of one other gesture, which can no longer be used in the current match. The Ukayag gesture is a bit deceptive, as it resembles rock when first thrown but gradually causes the hand to condense into a lump of inert material, not dissimilar to actual igneous rock. The knuckles as well begin to exude a superheated mineral substance similar to molten lava. Ukayag exclusively beats paper and appears to lose to everything else. Many of the gestures on record have no known name, but their function within SCP-4633's altered rules is clear from the context in which they were used. Such is the case with one anomalous gesture, which caused most of the player's hand to withdraw into a siphon-like opening at their wrist before the very same orifice shot out a stream of ink into the opposing player's eyes. While there was no lasting harm done to the opponent by this gesture, the ink did cause temporary blindness, which persisted until they were defeated by way of their rock losing to paper. Another unknown gesture has been seen beating both Izurgav and Ukayag. This gesture makes the player's hand resemble the crest and gas-filled body of a Pacific man-o'-war. These examples are only scraping the surface of the seemingly endless possibilities that SCP-4633 has to offer. As you can see, the anomalous hand gestures can be just as dangerous within the game itself as the permanent changes they invoke in the user. While the Foundation has done its best to contain all information surrounding SCP-4633, there have been clear efforts by several unknown groups to push the game into continued usage. Over the past 3 decades, instances of SCP-4633 have seen increasing popularity in the world of high-stakes gambling. Perhaps it is because of the inherent thrill of watching two opponents trying to strategically outwit each other with a countless number of non-standard gestures, but more likely, it is part of the anomalous effect of SCP-4633 that the game would appeal to those desperate to risk everything on the slim chance of victory. This neatly brings us to the SCP-4633 related incident which occurred aboard the private ocean liner known as the SS Fateful Emma. Before the incident, the Fateful Emma would sail into international waters twice a year. Each time it would bring along a new group of passengers, seemingly selected from the underprivileged and downcast sector of society. A great many of these passengers were convicts with repeat violent offenses chosen from supermax facilities the world over. The process by which these inmates were chosen for a voyage aboard the ship was not dissimilar from the methods the Foundation uses to acquire new Class D personnel. Naturally, this was how the research team was able to be tipped off about the Fateful Emma. It became apparent soon after looking into the ship's career that the individuals altered by the effects of SCP-4633 had been seen departing from the ship on multiple occasions in remote island harbors. Most of the time, the individuals would also be, to the best of their ability with their metamorphized forms, carrying briefcases filled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash. While witnesses tend to write off the strange appearances of those affected as being the result of a deformity or injury, or in more pronounced instances dismissing the encounters as sightings of creatures from the local mythology, it was clear to anyone familiar with SCP-4633 what was truly going on. These passengers were being made to play pitched games of rock, paper, scissors featuring SCP-4633 for massive sums of wealth, and what was worse, the grand prize winners were seemingly being released back into civilization without the knowledge of law enforcement. Of course, what the Foundation was most concerned about was the potential for the large-scale leak of detailed information involving SCP-4633. It seemed that the Foundation's latest faceless enemy had revealed itself. Whatever wealthy group of individuals was pulling the strings behind the games aboard the SS Fateful Emma, it was very likely that the ship was also well protected by a private army of trained mercenaries. In a display of swift but necessary initiative, the Foundation assembled a brand new mobile task force to be dispatched onto the ocean liner, Mobile Task Force Row 52, with the fitting codename Rochambeau. The mobile task force would board the vessel secretly and use whatever means necessary to prevent the spread of SCP-4633 and any evidence of the associated non-standard hand gestures. Before the fateful Emma's next voyage, the Foundation isolated the port where it would depart from and made sure that the MTF agents were in position. The operation was co-captained by Agent Dubois and Agent Zhang, both of whom prided themselves on having extraordinarily good luck. Agent Dubois would stealthily move the majority of the agents under his command into the cargo hold below deck and await Agent Zhang's signal. Agent Zhang himself would assume the name and identity of one of the criminal passengers, who was intercepted before boarding by the mobile task force. The would-be participant was subsequently detained and brought into the Foundation as a Class D personnel. As the SS Fateful Emma began to leave the harbor, Agent Zhang joined the other passengers who had been gathered together in an enormous function hall. There was little indication of when the games would begin, and Zhang made an effort to keep a low profile until more information was available. Shortly after the ship had officially arrived in international waters, an eccentric man entered the room on a walkway that overlooked the rest of the passengers. He was flanked by a pair of armed bodyguards. It was plain from the man's style of dress and demeanor that he was both absurdly wealthy and completely out of his mind. He wore a pure white tuxedo and a scarf that seemed to have been made from the fur of a Siberian tiger. A pair of dark shades with sequin rims obscured his eyes from view, but by far the strangest aspect of the rich man was the fact that emerging from the wrist of his right arm was the eyeless head of a moray eel where his hand should be. The man spoke, addressing the entire room. "Welcome, passengers new and old, to the SS Fateful Emma. While you are aboard this ship, your fate is in your own hands. Over the next 24 hours, you will have the rare opportunity to play the greatest game of chance that humanity has ever known. Generations of people from every continent and every walk of life have given their all to the mastery of rock, paper, scissors, across, north, block, //. The man proceeded to speak unusual syllables for the next minute straight without even a pause for breath. In his report, Agent Zhang described the man's voice as gaining an increasingly loud hum as his speech continued, and that some of the syllables didn't seem to be the product of human vocal cords. He soon concluded his string of gibberish and resumed speaking intelligible language. As is customary, we will be utilizing the Iljesh Toi rules. You will begin by selecting a single opponent and challenging them to a best of 2 of 3 match. This is a single elimination tournament, and any competitors who cannot otherwise continue to engage in matches will also be eliminated. By the end of your time here, the luckiest among you will be named the undisputed champion of these games, and will be granted unlimited freedom, along with the cash prize. The rest of you will have to determine your own fates, for you all know what awaits you below. May your hands be ready, your minds be sharp, and remember, winning is everything." With a flourish of his moray eel hand, the wealthy man finished his introductions and promptly exited the room. Agent Zhang looked at the passengers surrounding him and saw that they were already beginning to play rock, paper, scissors with each other. A few had already begun using the anomalous gestures, warping their limbs into hideous subnautical shapes. Agent Zhang gave the signal to Agent Dubois and the rest of the mobile task force to begin the operation. Their target was primarily the moray-handed man, as well as any other close associates that he had on board. They would capture him alive and interrogate him into revealing the mystery behind this illegal gambling ring. Once the mercenaries were dealt with, Agent Dubois' team would further command the ocean liner and navigate it to SCP Foundation Research Site 45 to await further orders. As for Agent Zhang, he knew what he had to do. To buy time, he would participate in the ensuing rock, paper, scissors tournament and eliminate as many of the other players as possible. This, he believed, was the best way to minimize the number of anomalous gestures that would be used aboard the ship. Of course, he himself wouldn't be using any of the anomalous gestures either, opting to limit himself to the standard 3. This could put him at a severe disadvantage over the course of the competition, but Agent Zhang knew better than to tempt fate. Still, being eliminated seemed like something he may want to avoid.
Even though the consequences for elimination were left vague in the strange rich man's speech, he still didn't feel that it would be wise to put himself in a compromised position while aboard the fateful Emma. Bracing himself for the worst, Agent Zhang accepted the challenge of a nearby passenger. He was off to a promising start when he threw a scissors hand against his opponent's paper. Because the matches were best 2 out of 3, all he needed was to win one of the next 2 matches, and he'd survive this round. Then he saw the devious look on his opponent's face, and he knew that this match was about to get weird. Rather than admit defeat, Agent Zhang prepared to throw scissors again. The two challenged their hands, and just as Zhang had feared, his opponent threw an anomalous gesture. Almost instantly, the opponent's hand took on a multi-mouthed piscine form, which began to spit sharp teeth in Agent Zhang's direction. Fortunately, the agent's bulletproof vest was able to withstand the impact of the teeth. What was even more fortunate was the fact that the opponent seemed to be a good sport. "Scissors beats Azravok, you win," said the other passenger before walking away in search of their next match. Curiously, the passenger's transformed arm continued to fire teeth across the room at random intervals, occasionally hitting and causing injury to one of the other competitors. Agent Zhang was grateful that the body armor he was wearing had been tested to withstand rapid fire from SCP-127. Compared to the raw power of the living gun, the teeth launched from Azravok gestures were practically BB rounds. He had succeeded in not being eliminated, both from the game and generally. Excited about his win, Zhang sought out another opponent to test his luck. Below deck, Agent Dubois and the rest of the mobile task force had just finished facing off against some of the hired mercenaries when they entered a room presumed to be the ocean liner's sickbay. Inside was a grisly sight. A second rock-paper-scissors tournament playing out between players that had been so thoroughly transformed by the anomalous gestures of SCP-4633 that they barely appeared to still be human. It was like a scene from a deep-sea documentary, with strange and unknowable creatures vying for dominance, not within a natural food chain or competition for resources, but within a seemingly never-ending struggle to win a game of chance. It was purgatory. Rock, paper, scissors, purgatory. Agent Dubois was appalled, but he knew better than to attempt to stop these creatures from doing the one thing keeping them all distracted. The moray-handed man was still somewhere in the ship, and capturing him was far more important. The research team would decide what to do with these former humans once the ship was secure within the Foundation's custody. However, what Agent Dubois didn't realize is that some of these creatures were advancing on his team. In nightmarish and unearthly voices they chanted, "Rock, rock, paper, scissors." Suddenly, one of the abominations, who resembled nothing more closely than an enormous mass of coral, produced 4 arms from within its body and began to throw anomalous hand signs towards the agents. One of the arms threw Ukyag, which coated an unsuspecting agent in hot lava, causing him to drop to the floor in pain. Panicked, Dubois ordered the task force to eliminate every living thing in the sickbay, although not in the sense of their tournament standing, of course. Meanwhile, Agent Zhang was on a win streak in the function hall. Through sheer luck and determination, he had managed to avoid elimination while eliminating several other passengers himself. He began to notice that those who were eliminated were quietly escorted away by the bouncers, seeming to have their anomalous changes treated. Now it was only down to 12 remaining passengers. Agent Zhang knew that it was only a matter of time before Dubois and his team took control of the ship, but feeling reckless, he challenged one of the remaining passengers. In that moment, something came over him, as if his determination to see the mission through was also compelling him to win at any cost. His opponent threw Pagakmar, and out of instinct, Zhang threw Vanyajek. The agent went on to win the entire tournament, but sadly, he was unable to collect the prize money, as during the skirmish below deck, the man with the moray hand had escaped with a small fortune in a high-speed submersible. His ultimate goals and the scope of the shadowy group he represented would remain unanswered for the time being. When the SS Fateful Emma finally arrived at Site 45, Agent Zhang came to his senses and realized that he had underestimated the cognitive side effects of SCP-4633. Due to the immediately recognizable anomalous state of both his arms, Agent Zhang was later contained on site with minimal security. It's believed that researchers are still searching for a method to reverse the effects. It just goes to show that winning isn't everything.
Ranger Halter felt the bark of the tree trunk slamming into his back. practically knocking all the air out of his lungs as he tried desperately to slow his frantic breathing. The sound of his own panting filled him with a sudden, horrifying thought. If he could hear his own ragged breaths, then it could hear them too. He clamped a hand over his mouth, clenching his jaw shut so tightly that he thought his teeth might splinter as he pushed them together. His free hand gripped the tranquilizer gun, shuddering as the snap of a twig rang out somewhere behind him. It had caught up to him already. He could bolt, make a quick dash for a cover behind another tree, but it was close enough now that it would see him. And if it did, it would come rushing after him with a speed that even a seasoned park ranger couldn't match. As much as he tried to force himself to stay still, the petrified curiosity got the better of him. Holter peeked out from behind the tree and immediately wished he hadn't. It had all started out as what sounded like an everyday occurrence. High atop his watchtower in the Glacier National Park, Ranger Holter had been enjoying the view of Montana's Rocky Mountains, a cup of coffee from his thermos in his hand. Then the familiar squawk of his radio had cut short his appreciation of the serene scenery. Holter sighed, tossing the remaining contents of the cup over the tower's railing, wondering what kind of day he was in for as he went to answer the radio. Most of the time, things in Glacier Park were as peaceful as they looked. But the park ranger knew that staying vigilant could make all the difference when it came to finding a missing hiker in time, or the difference between deterring a group of campers away from a family of bears and having a hell of a mess to clean up. He pushed down on the button for the microphone, connected to the bulky radio that took up practically an entire desk. "Holter, thank God," came the relieved voice from the other side. "We've been trying to reach everyone, put them on alert. We've got trouble. Reports of a coyote gone feral attacking folks." "I'm on it," Holter replied, grabbing his gear from the cramped watchtower as he continued to speak into the mic. "Where did the report come in from?" "Not far from your station. I'd say about a click west from your position." Stowing his tranquilizer gun, Ranger Holter descended the ladder from his watchtower down to ground level. As a park ranger, Holter valued the environment he worked in. And as a fan of the SCP universe, we know how much you value intricate world building, or in some cases, world destroying. But either way, we couldn't be happier to introduce you to the sponsor of today's video, World Anvil. World Anvil is a comprehensive set of world building tools that not only help you craft and organize your unique setting, but also present it in a captivating manner. From wiki-like articles and interactive maps to a full-fledged RPG campaign manager and novel writing software, World Anvil has everything a world creator could dream of. World Anvil equips you with over 25 templates, prompting you to dive deeper into your creations. Enrich your content by embedding maps, images, sound effects, and even little secrets for that immersive touch. With their innovative design, you can easily visualize your world through maps, chronicle its history with timelines, and fine-tune events with intricate details. Your crafted world can be beautifully showcased on a unique homepage, inviting others to dive into your vision. Got a sudden idea while working on another? No problem. World Anvil lets you swiftly create new articles or link existing ones, ensuring you never lose track of your inspiration. But my personal favorite feature is their interactive maps. Beyond just creating and uploading your own designs, you can directly link your creations, allowing for a dynamic and engaging experience. And if you're collaborating, invite your team to refine, write, and even let your fans chip in. I'm currently working on my own interactive map of Site 17, and maybe I'll even let you see it when I'm done. But don't wait for me. Dive into World Anvil yourself and elevate your world-building game. And here's a treat. Use our link in the description to go to worldanvil.com and use the code SCP to grab a whopping 51% off any yearly subscription. Explore, create, and share with World Anvil. The sun was already starting to dip out of sight behind the trees. Pretty soon it'd be pitch black, save for the beam of his flashlight. He had to move fast. Coyotes were only known to attack humans on rare occasions. Usually they kept away, at least enough to make them a minimal risk. But waiting for him just west of the watchtower wasn't a coyote, at least not at first. Watching it from behind the tree moments later, Ranger Holter's stomach turned at the sight of the creature. It walked bipedally, like a human, but the shape was all wrong. Its legs looked broken, but that hadn't stopped it from catching up. Instead of bending at the knee, they were Z-shaped, pointing back behind the creature, then twisting back again in the opposite direction at the joint. They looked more like the legs of a dog, but they were far too big. The same could be said of the arms, bent out of shape at multiple points like its legs were. The creature was a mess of misshapen limbs, The cartilage in its ears had seemingly reformed into points, and there were claws protruding from its fingertips, practically bursting out from where a human's fingernails would be. But beneath it all, and what alarmed Ranger Holter the most, was its skin. It had darkened in patches, layers of fur sprouting over those areas, but there were still parts that remained clear, where skin, human skin, was still visible, peeling away to reveal the new fur-coated layer underneath. It looked like a grotesque accident, like something ripped straight out of an old horror movie, the kind of monster that a mad scientist would make by haphazardly splicing DNA and playing God. Holter checked the tranquilizer gun in his trembling fingers, still empty after that most recent shot. He reached for another dart, slowly sliding it into the loading mechanism and readying the pistol. It cocked and made a sound. The creature's malformed head turned, snapping directly towards the source of the noise, directly towards Holter. He turned to sprint away, trying to expand the distance between him and it. If he was too close, the dart wouldn't have enough momentum when he pulled the trigger. The toe of his boot snagged on something solid, unmoving, a root from the tree he'd been hiding behind. He felt himself tumble, landing with a hard thud against the forest floor. His gun, it had fallen from his grasp. He scrabbled around in the dirt for it, barely able to see where the tranquilizer had landed in the dark. Just as his fingertips brushed past something metal, Holter felt the force of something heavy strike his back again. This time, though, it wasn't a tree. It was the creature. It snarled, gnashing its candid jaws that were protruding out of its skull, rows of sharp teeth that had uprooted the old ones, burying themselves into the park ranger's neck and not letting go, until he'd stopped moving for good. A few short hours later, a convoy of mysterious unmarked vehicles arrived at Glacier National Park. The rest of the park rangers who had reported the strange activity were approached by shadowy figures who refused to give their names or offer up any form of identification other than just referring to themselves as experts in things like this. Not long after, none of the others would remember Ranger Holter or the incident that had led to his untimely death. After administering amnestics, it didn't take the SCP Foundation search party long to discover a lone coyote sniffing around the remains of a park ranger covered in blood. The wild animal was captured, to be brought back for testing before being re-released into the wild. Meanwhile, the Foundation scoured the rest of the area until they came across the real culprit. Standing in a clearing a short distance from a footpath through the forest was SCP-1579. Of course, the next challenge was getting it packed up and transported to Biosite 66 without touching it. To the untrained eye, SCP-1579 looks to be fairly unassuming, even as far as anomalous objects go. It is simply an old wooden sculpture, the kind that can even be occasionally found in various wooded areas throughout the world. Its age is apparent from even one cursory glance at SCP-1579. The partial damage to its cedar surface speaking to the numerous years it has existed for, along with the bright green moss that covers it. Although, curiously, this moss doesn't seem to dry out and die in responses to changes in humidity, nor does it affect SCP-1579's structural integrity. As for where it came from and who made it, those are still unknown, as if the answer to what holds SCP-1579's anomalous properties, whether or not the cedar it was carved from or the moss coating the sculpture possesses some unknown properties, or if SCP-1579 was somehow imbued with these after being created. Initial testing by the SCP Foundation's researchers determined SCP-1579 to have an abnormally high resistance to the type of damage wood, and particularly cedar wood, is susceptible to. For one, it does not seem to show any signs of rotting or natural degradation. For another, it is also resistant to heat, at least to a certain extent. It doesn't burn the same way other objects constructed from cedar wood. However, this sculpture is not entirely indestructible. Pieces can be easily chipped off of the main body of SCP-1579, and these splintered fragments continue to carry the same anomalous effects as the rest of the sculpture, even when separate from it. But of course, you want to know about the creature. How does this supposedly harmless, if a little structurally abnormal cedar wood sculpture connects to whatever it was that killed Park Ranger Holter? Well, it's quite simple actually. SCP-1579 killed Holter. Not directly, you understand, but by proxy, through its further anomalous properties. Still confused? Well then, How about a demonstration? Let's take a look at one of the Foundation's preferred test subjects, an expendable member of D-Class personnel, probably spending multiple life sentences working here at the SCP Foundation rather than behind the bars of a maximum security institution. Now, what would happen if you place this delightful individual in the same room as SCP-1579? Well, nothing initially. That is, until the subject touches the cedar wood surface of the sculpture, either out of curiosity or following the instructions of a Foundation researcher. That's when the real anomaly starts. The wooden sculpture will exhibit a slight but observable movement, shuddering slightly as if moved by an unseen force. This will precede the person who touched the object feeling a burning sensation, that kind of irritating, painful heat that spreads underneath the surface of the skin. The burning will always begin at the area of their body that made direct contact with SCP-1579, and touching it again at any point will trigger a reactivation of the sculpture's anomalous effects. Subjects experiencing the effects of SCP-1579 have described the feeling as being akin to a bad sunburn that rapidly spreads across the skin from the point of contact, only to stop once it has affected a person's entire body. Following the subsidence of the burning sensation, subjects experiencing the side effects of touching SCP-1579 will notice an immediate change to their skin. Within a window of 3 minutes, their skin becomes thin and paper-like in its texture, before starting to peel away. Once this stage occurs, the peeling skin will reveal a new layer underneath, hence the colloquially used codename for this anomaly, different skin. However, this so-called different skin isn't merely a new layer of otherwise ordinary human skin. Instead, it will belong to another species entirely. A person coming into contact with SCP-1579 will find themselves rapidly developing new skin that shares the physical traits, as well as matching DNA, to that of a number of animal species. It should be noted that these features will continue to rapidly develop until the subject is entirely transformed, and is no longer considered to qualify as a human being. As for the specific transformation that occurs, there are a number of known outcomes that repeat in the following cycle. Let's say our D-Class, we'll call them Subject A, touched SCP-1579 at the start of the cycle. They would, after the burning sensation stops and peeling begins, start to sprout dark feathers across their torso, arms, and upper legs, likely with a great deal of pain as the sharp quill of these feathers start to burst out from beneath the skin. Beneath the knees, Subject A will see their legs start to become yellow and scaly, as well as a change that causes their toenails to simply start to painfully protrude outwards until they form pointed, blackened talons. Subject A's face will also start to grow feathers. However, these grow outwards away from the areas of the nose and mouth. Flight feathers will also protrude from the forearms, multiplying in number until their entire body is covered, at which point Subject A, on every level including genetically, more closely resembles a Corvus corax, more commonly known as the common raven, than a human being anymore. Take another test subject, Subject B, and get them to touch SCP-1579 right after. Their different skin is covered in brown fur that's approximately 4 inches long. Their lips and skin underneath the fur will darken, and their nose will become constantly moist. Claws will start to grow from their fingertips, although these will be notably smaller than those of a fully grown creature of the same species, an Ursus arctos horribilis, or a grizzly bear. Then we get to the point in the cycle where some unwitting hiker encountered SCP-1579 in the forests of Glacier National Park, Montana. When this subject, Subject C, touched the cedar sculpture, their skin began to grow layered fur, as the cartilage of their ears is separated from their tissue and replaced by new, reshaped cartilage. Much like Subject B, who SCP-1579 turned into a grizzly bear, Subject C also had darkened skin, a moistened nose, and longer, sharper nails. It was at some point during this transformation that an unassuming park ranger stumbled upon Subject C. Frightened by what he saw, this ranger was unable to identify that what he interpreted as attacks by some kind of half-human, half-animal hybrid were actually desperate pleas for help, as Subject C was transformed into a coyote. Although it's hard to say which physiological change triggered by SCP-1579 is the most alarming or unpleasant to experience, the fourth kind is in no way any more pleasant than the preceding three in the cycle. Subject D of this particular series of tests will find the new layer of skin that emerges under the old to be hairless and of a green coloration, often with brown markings. Unlike the previous instances, their skin will rapidly begin to dry out, and seems to be far more reactive to the humidity of the surrounding environment. It is also far thinner than that of the skin possessed by other transformations that SCP-1579 causes. So thin, in fact, that the eyeballs of Subject D will be visible through its eyelids, which rapidly become translucent, similar to those of the Suracris regula, otherwise known as the Pacific tree frog. Repeated activation of SCP-1579's anomalous properties will trigger the next transformation in the cycle, whether the cedarwood sculpture is touched by a new subject, or repeatedly by the same person. In the latter instance, where a subject is re-exposed to SCP-1579, the additional changes their body undergoes will be significantly more painful. Their already newly replaced outer layer of skin will fail to dry out, and will begin bleeding instead. 3 or 4 consecutive exposures to SCP-1579 will lead to excessive bodily trauma for the subject, usually causing them to die from shock before the 4th transformation is complete. And as we're sure you can imagine, an amalgamation of a human, a raven, a grizzly bear, a coyote, and a tree frog is hardly a pleasant sight. This unfortunate fate was suffered during one of the first incidents with SCP-1579 that brought the Foundation's attention to it. During an elementary school field trip, a teacher who was explaining the history of totem poles in Native American culture accidentally touched SCP-1579. While experiencing the pain of her transformation, she fell against the sculpture in a panic, not realizing it had been what caused her to change. This repeated triggering of the object's anomalous effects led to her untimely death, an event that had to be wiped from the minds of her students by the Foundation, using the careful application of Class B amnestics. For now, SCP-1579 is kept in a secure, sterile environment at a Foundation storage warehouse, where personnel are not permitted to make any contact with it. So there's no need to worry about accidentally running into SCP-1579 in the wild. Although, there are always plenty of other things to worry about while out on a hike through the forest. Things that could be right behind you.
The creature let out an unmistakable squeal of rage as stimulus Y-835 took effect. Dr. Christensen pressed his face up against the glass, eager to see the results. It had to work this time. It simply had to. He was certain that this attempt would make all the other failures worth it, and he'd once again prove the Foundation's faith in him to be well-placed. SCP-5683 shrieked a loud, insect-like sound that would have normally made the blood run cold of anyone that heard it. But to Dr. Christensen, it was like music, a monster's dying fanfare to mark his success. Soon he'd be the researcher who neutralized not one, but 2 tenacious, highly adaptable anomalies. The senior researcher could feel his heart racing as the deadly giant spider started to twitch, then burst into 2 identical entities. The pair of arachnid anomalies had reacted much like the results of the tissue sample tests conducted earlier, dividing into 2 separate organisms. Christensen held his breath. The tissue samples had destroyed each other, attacking and injecting the other with lethal doses of venom. Surely, he reasoned, duplicating SCP-5683 into 2 would have the same result. His heart sank as he watched one of the spider creatures, the duplicate, perish almost immediately. As it often did when presented with human prey, SCP-5683 attacked using its mandibles and impaled its copy with its front legs to pin it in place. The clone had bitten back, with Dr. Christensen already knowing that would have granted SCP-5683 an immunity to its own venom. Its powers of adaptation were fiercely, frustratingly efficient, and nothing demonstrated this more than the intense reaction from the man tasked with destroying it. Dr. Christensen hurled the nearest object, a coffee mug, at a glass window of the observation room, overlooking the test chamber. He pounded his fist against the glass, hardly with the required force to cause damage, but enough to send pain shooting down Christensen's wrist, which then nestled in his forearm, a reminder that the experiment, like the others, had failed.
Why can't I destroy you?
he muttered through clenched teeth, looking with hatred at the enormous spider in the chamber below. The directive had reached him the day immediately after New Year's Day 2020, and straight from a member of the O5 Council no less. Their message expressed how impressed the Council was with Dr. Christensen's success with the Doomsday Clock project, and how favorably his name had been mentioned in Council meetings. This boded well for the ambitious Foundation doctor. He'd been hoping to snag the director position at Site-04 now that Director Bray had retired. But there was one more test from the O5 Council. They wanted Dr. Christensen to use the knowledge garnered during his previous success to solve the SCP-5683 problem. If he could successfully complete that assignment, it would be his ticket to being promoted. With the comfy role of site director and all its perks in mind, Dr. Christensen accepted the assignment from the Council to deal with SCP-5683. SCP-5683 was quite the beast, not an anomaly for those with intense arachnophobia. The huge spider-like organism was extremely hostile towards humans and had to be kept in a constant state of medical sedation. Otherwise, it would relentlessly attempt to breach containment and slaughter any and all personnel in its path. What had made SCP-5683 such a problem for the Foundation was the creature's ability to rapidly regenerate damage, as well as modify its own body in reaction to threats. Much like a certain particularly hard-to-destroy reptile, the spider-like entity could adapt itself to become more resistant to any danger posed to it. And of course, this meant that the Foundation needed this dangerous creature eradicated. The frequent containment breaches and sheer number of casualties caused by the arachnid anomaly were significant enough to cause an increasing drain on the SCP Foundation's resources. So, with the termination order coming from the very top, the O5 Council themselves, Dr. Christensen was tasked with overseeing the neutralization of SCP-5683. During an initial deliberation, Dr. Christensen met with researcher Miles and Hall, junior researcher Silva, and security chief Ade to discuss earlier attempts to terminate SCP-5683. The new head of the termination project was perturbed to learn that the research team had little in the way of useful information to offer, beyond what the Foundation already knew about the creature. But Christensen decided some basic stress testing would at least be a start. After a successful tissue sample test, wherein some of SCP-5683's genetic material was incinerated, Dr. Christensen tried to simply destroy the spider with fire. An understandable response, to say the least. However, exposing SCP-5683 to temperatures of 850 degrees Celsius for just 30 seconds didn't quite yield the easy victory he had hoped for. The arachnid thrashed about and screeched in reaction to the heat, only to rapidly develop a form of armor plating covering its entire body. The armor was comprised of an unknown, unidentifiable substance, but it was enough to prevent SCP-5683 from combusting. Reconvening with the rest of the team, Dr. Christensen hid his pride, assuring everyone he was just trying to establish a baseline during the previous test. Of course, he hadn't believed that terminating SCP-5683 with fire would be a success, or so he claimed, hiding how much he'd longed for an easy solution so he could snatch up the vacant Site-04 director position. But to ensure the others, Christensen explained that he'd requisitioned some anomalous materials from the O5 Council that they'd be using in their next termination attempts. Nothing that was anomalous enough to require containment, but toxic enough that they presented a few options for destroying SCP-5683. Just for logging purposes, sir, may I inquire about the specific substances we're shipping in? Junior researcher Sylvia had asked. Of course, Y220, Y835, and Y43. Dr. Christensen quickly recounted them all from memory. I'm told they should be arriving within the week. I expect each would be enough to do the job, but it's best to hedge our bets. This spider doesn't compare to the lizard, I'll tell you that. Junior researcher Silva seemed to take an interest in what Dr. Christensen had just alluded to, his previous work with the lizard. He probed further about it, and Christensen gave a solemn response. The aspiring Foundation doctor recalled an incident from a few years earlier during his experimentation with SCP-682. Some of the methods Dr. Christensen had opted to employ in an attempt to destroy the hard-to-destroy reptile had led to a severe containment breach.
When describing it, he used the word unpleasant, perhaps out of guilt at how many personnel had lost their lives due to his actions. Brushing the topic aside, he assured the team to get on with testing the new anomalous stimuli on SCP-5683. Stimulus Y220 initially showed some promise. During a tissue sample test, it successfully converted part of SCP-5683 into glass, which then violently exploded, leaving nothing behind. But attempts to use it to neutralize the creature itself quickly quashed those promising results. Within 9 seconds of being exposed to Stimulus Y220, SCP-5683's body rapidly turned to glass. Around 80% of its arachnid mass proceeded to explode, shattering in all directions, sending clear shards showering over the testing chamber. As he watched, Dr. Christensen allowed himself to believe that this was mission accomplished, that he'd successfully terminated SCP-5683. But his celebration was premature. The spider quickly began reconstituting itself, its body regenerating within the space of 30 seconds. After testing with both stimuli Y220 and Y835, Dr. Christensen's frustration seemed to be increasing with each failed attempt. He knew his promotion was within reach, and as far as he could remember, he'd done good work with damaging SCP-682. Why should eradicating this anomalous spider be any different? However, it was a test with stimulus Y436 that enraged the ambitious doctor. Expecting the anomalous stimulant to turn SCP-5683 into a fine mist, Christensen watched as the creature's body vanished, literally vaporizing, changing states of matter to little more than water in the air. Suddenly, every light in the facility powered off, plunging the testing chamber into darkness. When the lights came back on, SCP-5683 was standing on all 8 legs, right where it had been missed only 3 seconds earlier. The research team had gathered for another mediation, and Dr. Christensen's anger still hadn't subsided. He kicked a chair to emphasize his frustration, alarming junior researcher Silva, who urged him to calm down. After eventually cooling his temper, Christensen made an announcement that caused even greater concern to spread amongst the team. I'm requisitioning Y910. Researcher Halls and Researcher Miles objected, trying to get Dr. Christensen to realize that the course of this action was excessive, overkill even. But Christensen disregarded them, standing by his latest method for terminating SCP-5683. The Global Occult Coalition had previously used Y910 to poison gods. He felt sure that it would work on one anomalous giant spider. His time was running short. Dr. Christensen was aware that any day now, the O5 Council would be appointing a replacement director of Site-04, and he wanted that promotion. And he didn't seem to care what corners he cut and what risks he took to get there, even if it meant endangering his research personnel. Dr. Christensen declared that in order to save time, he would be bypassing tissue samples to test for termination attempts. The longer it took to terminate the anomalous arachnid, the more his window of opportunity closed, and the further the director position slipped from his fingertips. Accepting full responsibility for the reckless decision and anything that might go wrong, Dr. Christensen wanted to use Stimulus Y910 directly on SCP-5683. He urged the research team to make the necessary preparations, unaware of what his decision would lead to, and the chaos it had already caused. The test was catastrophic, so much so that it caused a containment breach. With SCP-5683 loose and scuttling about the facility on its multiple legs, Dr. Christensen and junior researcher Silva were forced to rush to the secure bunker on site for safety. Christensen was in a state of panic until he noticed something, and not for the first time either. He'd been detecting a foul smell whenever he'd conducted the meetings to discuss termination options. But the other members of the research team had quickly explained it was nothing more than repeated accidents in the cafeteria. But here was the stench again, worse than ever. Yet junior researcher Silva brushed it off again, stating that SCP-5683 must have gotten into the facility's reactor. The junior researcher quickly became inconsolable, stating that the whole situation was his fault. Dr. Christensen interjected, demanding to know how it was and what Silva had done to cause this situation. He replied that it was his duty to oppose ill-advised actions, and when Christensen had declared his intention to use Y910, the junior researcher hadn't opposed him.
Shifting the blame from himself onto his subordinate, Dr. Christensen chastised Silva over how many personnel had died because of the junior researcher's refusal to do his job, ignoring that it was Christensen's own ambitions that had led to the current chaos. Refusing to be made a scapegoat, Dr. Christensen vowed to pin the full culpability for SCP-5683's containment breach onto junior researcher Silva, saying he'd tell the O5 Council the so-called truth about what had happened. But Silva pointed out that there wasn't much of a likelihood that the bunker would survive the reactor overloading. He urged the ambitious Foundation doctor to admit some responsibility of his own for what had happened, but Christensen refused. Suddenly, there came a thunderous banging at the bunker door. A debilitating pang of fear struck Dr. Christensen, causing him to scream and retreat from the entrance, yelling "no" and "please," as if he was pleading with the universe itself to spare him from the spider. Junior researcher Silva walked over to the bunker door just as strong arachnid legs tore the heavy steel bulkhead off its hinges like it was made of little more than wet paper. There was SCP-5683, the enormous spider skittering into the bunker, screeching all the while. Silva had put himself between SCP-5683 and the ambitious Foundation doctor, whose hunger for a promotion had led to all this carnage. The junior researcher announced his noble intention to sacrifice himself, occupying the creature while urging Christensen to run. The doctor shoved Silva towards the spider and prepared to run, then all of a sudden, SCP-5683 vanished. Junior researcher Silva told Dr. Christensen he was disappointed, before researcher Miles, researcher Hall, and security chief Ade all entered the bunker through the torn open hole where the door had been. Christensen questioned where SCP-5683 had gone, to which Silva explained there was little reason to keep a dummy around once it had served its purpose as a substitute. "You mentioned you worked with the lizards, sir," the junior researcher recounted, "that there was a containment breach. If you don't terribly mind me asking, how did you escape that situation? It seemed quite lethal, didn't it?" Afraid and confused, Dr. Christensen asked where he was. Hall and Miles urged him not to ask questions he already knew the answer to. Silva explained who they all were, a jury, specifically Dr. Christensen's jury, and according to them, the ambitious doctor had disgraced himself again. Christensen had been there for a long time, a considerably long time, reliving the same events over and over again, with SCP-5683 acting as a substitute for SCP-682. It was the same situation, he'd made the same decisions, the same mistakes, and it had cost lives. Now Dr. Christensen was trapped in an endless loop, penance for the casualties that had occurred at his hands, all in the pursuit of his own selfish personal gain. He asked the jury how long he'd be stuck there, a question Silva responded to with, "Until you take responsibility, sir." Immediately, Dr. Christensen tried to admit that this all had been his fault, but he didn't mean it. Not really. He hadn't accepted blame. He just wanted a quick and easy way out of the loop, and the jury of his deceased personnel knew it. Christensen ran for the door in the hopes of escaping his fate. Futile as his chances were, a black iron chain appeared from around the corner and wrapped itself around the overambitious doctor's throat. Ignorant of his pleas for forgiveness, saying he was sorry wouldn't bring back the people who died in service of his aspirations to becoming a site director. The chain dragged Dr. Christensen through the facility at such a speed that he collided with every wall and every corner as he turned sharply, being pulled along the floor. But that and the walls quickly crumbled away, revealing a sight that made Dr. Christensen start screaming that it wasn't his fault, and he never really stopped. What followed involved a great deal of blood and fire. Once it was over, it left behind the same awful stench the doctor had smelt before, and he'd soon be smelling it again too, as the cycle repeated itself. The directive had come straight from a member of the O5 Council. They were impressed with Dr. Christensen, and the ambitious Foundation doctor had been hoping to snag a director position at Site-04. But there was one final test for Dr. Christensen to solve the SCP-5683 problem. It's such a beautiful day out here. The air is alive with birdsong and the gentle bubbling of nearby brooks. There are ancient oak trees everywhere, reaching up into the sky and forming a dense canopy. The occasional shaft of light spears through amongst the leaves, illuminating the lush green moss on the ground below, as soft and perfect underfoot as a brand new rug. This might seem like we're just having a pleasant jaunt through a local forest here at SCP Explained, but take a closer look at the trees. This isn't just any forest, dear viewers. That's right. After years of attempted espionage and infiltration, we are here at long last. The Wanderer's Library, the limitless interdimensional archive of all knowledge in the multiverse, often frequented by the Serpent's Hand via portals known as the Ways. Who would have guessed that the secret to getting inside was just asking very politely and promising not to steal any of the books? We should just try being nice more often. But hey, as the dispensers of user-friendly animated knowledge here on YouTube, we felt that we ought to share this bounty of limitless knowledge with you. The wing of the Wanderer's Library we're seeing right now is known as the Hidden Nest. It's a good starting point for new scholars perusing the boundless texts available beyond dimensions. How about we begin with this collection over here, King Shosh's Shelf. Try saying that 3 times fast. And then take a look at the inscription above the case.
The Lord of the Lazy. His kingdom is anywhere in which sloth reigns above activity, in the hearts of all those devote to lounging over labor. He and his secret army wage a war against all doers, a battle for the universe that can only end in the cessation of all motion in the universe, or total unstoppable chaos.
Lord of the Lazy, Sounds like me when I clock off for the weekend. Let's crack the spines on a few of these dusty old volumes and take a look inside. First, we have On the Common Vampire, an extract from the thought-to-be-lost Saint Emile's Bestiary, translated into English by the famed scholar of the anomalous known as Rounderhouse. It is an indispensable source of knowledge for those who are aware of, and rightly fear, the vampires that lurk in the dark all around us. It goes into great detail about the biology of the common vampire, also known as Vampire Draculae, and believed to be the progenitor to all other vampire species, as well as their diet, behavior, and the best methods of hunting them. The following is a brief extract.
Vampire Draculae is largely similar in shape and form to Homo sapiens sapiens, an erect biped with a wingspan roughly equivalent to its height. The most obvious feature discerning them from a human is the shape of their hands. The vampire's hands are claw-like, with long, hard nails extending up to 2 centimeters, often sharpened to a point. The muscles in these hands are taut and powerful. They can be quickly contracted to exert immense pressure on anything in the vampire's grasp. This ability is commonly used to crush the skulls or bones of prey. Naturally, the vampire's teeth are the second source of notability. The fangs of a vampire are stuff of legend, and it is difficult to extricate myth from fact. Dissection of the adult specimens have noted sexual dimorphism in the dental region. While males have 28 teeth to the female's 20, they are less dangerous. 4 of the males can be described as fangs, both front-facing, 2 on the top and 2 on the bottom, each a centimeter above the gum line. Comparatively, females have 8 fangs, 4 on the front and 2 on each side. Her front fangs are up to 1.5 centimeter above the gum line. The legends have preserved one important bit of truth regarding the fangs. They are used almost exclusively to suck blood from the vampire's prey. They bite into the flesh, most often of the neck or thigh, and the vampire uses its lips to create a seal around the incisions before sucking. However, study of their feeding habits has led me to an intriguing discovery. As soon as the beast separates itself from its prey, its saliva soothes the wound and encourages faster clotting. While this is pure speculation, your author theorizes that this is an adaptation to preserve the life of the prey in order to remain a consistent food source.
A truly fascinating piece of technical literature. Next, of course, there is the short but haunting piece titled Leavings of Another World, written by the great thinker Jack Manganese. This tome carries an important lesson to all who wander through the hallowed halls of the Wanderer's Library.
about the power of words. But it's not the kind of power you might think. Allow this extract to expand on that. Words have power. Indeed, they have the power to create, but mostly they have the power to destroy. Does that really surprise you? Let me demonstrate. Please think of an animal, any animal. It could be anything, right? Two-legged, four-legged, winged, anything. But now suppose I said, think of a quadruped. It can no longer be two-legged, can it? It can no longer be a bird or a fish. And if I said, think of a black, domesticated feline, your choices are narrower still. And finally, think of Bastet, my pet black cat. At that point, you have no choices at all. You may believe that each step gives you more information, but what it really does is limit your imagination and destroy possibilities. The power to destroy, you see, is much greater than the power to create. You didn't notice because you, yourself, are a creature of thoughts, ideas, language, and ultimately, of words. Suppose I told you there was once a world without language, without ideas, without words. Of course, world itself is a word, so it wasn't really a world, but we have to call it something now, don't we? In this world, there were no limitations. Everything that could be was. Everything that couldn't be also was. It was a vast place of infinite complexity, but also of infinite simplicity. Since everything that was or wasn't also was or wasn't everything else, the endless variety was, in fact, all the same. You say it's difficult to describe? Indeed, that's the point. It can't be described. It was everything and anything and something and nothing, and all at once and not at all. What happened to it? Words, of course. It started with a single simple word in a language that no one speaks anymore. No one knows where it came from or how it sounded, but I'll tell you what it meant. It meant red. And as soon as there was red, there was also not red. The world had been neatly cloven into red any every somethings and not red any every somethings. It was the first division, and the very idea of division spawned more ideas and more words. One, two, separate, together, us, them, and from these came more, many, many more. The piece then goes on to reveal that the proliferation of language destroyed this world further, until all that was left was the wreckage, our world. How a universe of infinite possibilities is slowly dulled by the ever-expanding power of nomenclature. Truly a disturbing thought for the more metaphysical among you. Let's take another book from King Shash's collection. Next comes a frightening parable about hubris from the bard, known as Jack of Trades. Like many a classic parable, this piece tells the tale of an intelligent spider, a jack of trades, as the story puts it, whose arrogance forges him into the architect of his own demise. Let's take a look at an extract, shall we? I once met a spider named Jack. A sizable fellow he was, the size of my fist and 8 legs as long as my hand. They were dexterous too, complementing his keen mind. That was where his name came from. Jack of Trades, for with each leg he would conduct each of his trades. With one he was a blacksmith, forging steel like silk, that with another he would spin into death traps. With a third he would contemplate the design of his web, for he was an architect. With the fourth he would climb the tallest of trees and bask in the daylight, so that all would see his splendor and in it take delight. Oh yes, he was proud. Why wouldn't he be? He was the most talented spider to have ever graced the land. His crafts as numerous as they were grand. I don't just weave webs, he said to me. I weave works of art. My traps instruments of death so much finer than all the rest. Then one day, Jack hatched a plan. Up the tallest of trees he climbed. He did not rest for 2 nights and 2 days until he reached the highest branch. The words some proclaim say he could touch the moon up there, but I digress. For one thing was certain. The height he had reached was a thing to impress. What Jack did next was more august still. Working each of his renowned legs, he weaved a web from the base of the branch to its end.
So mighty in scale was it that he said it would catch him the sun and make him master of all that it touched. It will bring me the moon too, he told me once, and with the light of the brightest star I shall be master of the night. Catch them he did, for as the sun climbed it found itself twined in the mesh of Jack's web. As for the moon, it soon found itself strewn with Jack's string, which clung to its opalescent veneer as it drew near to its ever-evasive lover, the bringer of day. Now they were tied to one another in Jack's trap for him to reign over. It was thus he crafted himself a throne of sunlight and moonlight, the very heavens made to bow before his majesty. Yet, it was not to last. The rest of the tale details the downfall of Jack the Spider as he devours the sun and moon above, driven by his boundless hunger for greatness. Soon enough, he was left with nothing to consume, and in his despair, tumbled from his web down to his doom. So is often the way with those pushed by unchecked ambition. Time to blow the dust off of another one of the library's forbidden texts. This one, entitled A Restless Wanderer on the Earth, is a particularly interesting piece for anyone fascinated by the enigmatic life of SCP-073, also known as Kane. This piece features a person named Bluebird buying a jar containing Kane's memories from a merchant, possibly affiliated with Marshall Carter and Dark Limited. It is a complex tale concerning many small fragments from Kane's life, thousands of years in the past. Here is a brief excerpt. The man found Kane, Ben Adam, in the endless wilderness of the Between Places. The man was beautiful to look upon, with bronze skin and shaggy black hair. His clothing was cut of animal skin, of fashions pleasing to the eye. But Kane was not pleased to see him. The man knew his name. "I am a priest," the man said. "A year ago you passed through my village. I wished to follow you then, but I was held back by the others. Then the crop failed, and a plague swept through our village. Only I was able to save myself, and then there were none to hold me back. I have searched for you since, and now I have finally found you." Kane frowned. He tried to wander only those lands where the soil was wild and suffused with power enough to resist his curse, or else lands where the inhabitants knew how to refresh the lands which his curse had made barren. When he needed to pass through civilization, he avoided the fields. He had long ago discovered that his curse had a limit, 48 cubits around him, or a length similar to 12 times his own height, enough to judge with the naked eye. But that did not account for the times he was not fully aware. Often taken with wanderlust, sometimes not even fully awake, he would walk in a trance according to where his feet took him alone. After these periods, he could awake having destroyed the entire harvest for a village. "I am truly sorry," Kane said. The man looked astonished. "You are Kane, the Wanderer, father of the lost children and the great beasts. You are the god of death. The other gods, the lesser gods, could not save my village. I worshipped them once. I despise them now. I come now to worship you." "They were your family," Kane said. "Even if they were not, I cannot be pleased about bringing more death to those who did not deserve it." "You are testing me, my lord," the man's teeth gleamed. "I promise you, I will not disappoint you. I will become your follower and your priest." "Foolish," Kane said and continued walking. The man followed him. It is clear that the curse Kane is forced to carry since committing the terrible sin of murder against his own brother weighs heavily upon him, and the powers he possesses now are both a blessing and a terrible detriment to the normal life he would have led. As with anything involving Kane, it is a deeply tragic tale. Next comes another insight into a normally secretive world, a piece entitled The Exhibition, written by an aspiring artist named Artifacts. The piece details his frustrating experience hosting his artwork at a private exhibition hosted by the sinister members of Marshall Carter and Dark Limited. And, of course, here is a brief extract.
"I had never been so disappointed before. Tonight was supposed to be my big night, the art exhibition that would have defined my career, hosted by the richest men of the anomalous world, Marshall Carter and Dark. Luminaries from all across the multiverse had come to see our work. I remember how surprised and excited I was to see the letter that I had even been accepted into the exhibition.
To receive one of these had been my dream since I was a child, learning about all the wonders of the anomalous on my father's knee. Oh, the letter looked so formal with the logo of M, C, and D printed at the bottom that I thought it sealed my future forever. I spent 5 hours fretting beforehand. I eventually settled on a suit to wear, a black and white chessboard pattern only with actual chess pieces that moved and played games over the fabric. I had specifically requested that it be made with some of the most famous games of history sewn into it. When I looked down at myself, I could not tell which game was which. Before I could second guess my choice of clothing, I looked at the time and realized that I was running slightly late and left in a hurry, rushing to the portal that the letter told me to go, in between a bookshop and a bowling alley. When I arrived, my astonishment at seeing the place was a feeling I would never forget. It was ridiculously surreal, like if M.C. Escher painted an art museum, and the museum was filled with Escher's paintings, with the paintings themselves being alive. Oh, the chandeliers were made from glowing crystals, almost looking more like disco balls than chandeliers. The crowd there was as impressive as the art, with all sorts of people from all sorts of dimensions, dressed in finest suits, capes, and cloaks that money could buy. As I approached the host, a tall, imposing figure with gray robes, a metal mask, and a mane of white hair, I felt very intimidated.
Yes. I've been awaiting your arrival, Natura.
He was saying to a woman before him, a human with a green dress that I would quickly notice was actually made out of leaves, and dark green hair to match flowing down past her shoulders, with flowers in her hair and clothes.
Your work is waiting for you in the West Wing.
The woman, who I assumed was named Natura, eagerly nodded and looked over to her right. She started walking so quickly she almost bumped into me.
The night didn't go much better for Artifix after that. His art pieces were a painting of a woman who makes you fall in love, a vase that kills anything put inside of it, and a little statue of an archer who fires real arrows. The representatives of Marshall Carter and Dark were not impressed by this meager display, leaving Artifix, who'd mainly gotten in from his father's business connections, feeling, well, let's say, less than stoked. But the Wanderer's Library isn't all just technical documents and prose. There's also a fair share of spellbinding poetry in these dusty old pages. Take, for example, Stars Wait for No Man, by the illustrious poet who goes only by Dr. Pan. It is a powerful and melancholy piece presented here in full.
The abyss is an infinitude, unknown and unknowable. Creatures with mouths over throats seek insight into their existence, gazing at that which only gazes back. They choke as they look, windpipes bent awkwardly, tears trickling from their eyes, windows reflecting, a goal unachievable. Eyes peer into darkness, searching for more and more, yearning, hoping, desiring, but not doing, never going, weeping at the beauty beyond reach. A number tried, reaching out to the void, but the others scoffed, drowning the doer with tears, all while they rested, their asses in the dirt. An eternity separates that which seeks and that which is sought. Eternity only grows as they gaze on, dreaming, but not doing. Stars wait for no man.
The Wanderer's Library is a truly fascinating place, with so much strange beauty and arcane knowledge to gather up and learn. Would you like us to cover more of the many esoteric volumes in the library's infinite shelves? Let us know down in the comments. And we thoroughly recommend you check out all the full tales in the library itself using the link in the description. Just be careful when you do so. It is so very easy to get lost in there.
Nobody should ever have to find out what a human body smells like, especially as it's being eaten. Sally clasped both hands over her face, trying desperately to block out the smell and to trap in her nervous breathing. She couldn't bring herself to look. Every bone in her body wanted to take off running through the forest, back out onto the interstate, to try and find some help. But there was nothing she could do. She could never outrun that thing. It was too fast, too savage. Even if she could convince someone on the highway to pull over and help her, they would just tell her she was going crazy. Maybe she was. Then the smell of her husband's body drifted over to her on the wind, as the crunching sound of inhuman jaws filled the air. Panic set in, then silence. She couldn't hear anything, not even a whisper in the trees. Had she done it? Had she survived? That's when a red sneaker stepped out from behind the tree, and Sally stared into the eyes of the blood-spattered hedgehog. Now, Sally had never been a gamer growing up. Sure, she played a little bit of Mario Kart and had a few Nintendogs back in the day, but the word gamer just wasn't for her. However, love conquers all, and when she found the man of her dreams, she decided that it would be worth at least giving some of his hobbies a go. They started off nice and easy, playing a bit of Stardew Valley, Minecraft, and maybe some Overcooked here and there. But before long, the pair of them were sitting down every day after work, headsets on and controllers in hand, ready to dive into the latest adventure. Just recently, the couple had gotten into retro games, going back and playing classics like Battletoads and Streets of Rage. The challenge was addictive, so when her husband John came home with a copy of an unmarked NES game, Sally was intrigued, to say the least. John explained that he had found it listed on eBay under a very suspicious account. He had gone to pick up the game after work that day, expecting to be greeted by the smiling face of the seller. Instead, he found a blank gray cartridge and a very brief manual wrapped together with an elastic band on a street corner. The seller had listed it for virtually nothing, and based on the description, seemed very eager to get rid of the game for some reason. So eager that he must not have wanted to stick around to even hand it over. Sally, already bored with this backstory, snatched the manual up and read the title of the game, Professor Gould's Terrifying Horror Challenge. There was no artwork, no branding, no publisher, no stickers, nothing to differentiate this game from being just a blank cartridge. As far as Sally knew, it could have been a virus, some kind of malware game designed to brick their NES. But the words horror and challenge from the title sold her. She blew on the pins in the cartridge and slotted it into place in the NES. A black screen appeared with nothing on it but two options, single player or two player. Sally uncoiled a second controller and handed it to John with a grin. You ready? Sally hit two player, and a new screen came up. Are the people holding the controllers the people who want to play the game? Yes or no? Sally hit yes. A shrill beep filled the room, high-pitched and grating on their ears. John immediately grabbed for the remote and turned the volume down on the TV, but the beep just kept going. The screen was a bright red, filling the room with an unnatural bloody light. John tried to hit the off button on the remote, but the TV stayed red, and the beeping sound continued, filling their tiny apartment. Getting up and rushing over to the TV, John tried to unplug it, but it was no use. The beeping noise and the red screen persisted. He looked back at his wife in confusion, but she was looking somewhere else entirely. There was a rat in the corner of the room with mottled fur, bloated flesh, and cracked teeth. It stared right into Sally's eyes, salivating. Without a moment's hesitation, she leaped up onto the couch and screamed. But instead of running away, the rat slowly crept forward, looking almost as if it was smiling. Then a second one appeared, crawling out from behind the couch, followed by a third in the doorway, and a fourth beneath the TV. Dozens of rats filled the room, swarming in from all directions, climbing over one another in a desperate attempt to get into the tiny apartment, to get to Sally and John. Sally clambered onto the couch with her laptop and tried to kick away any of the rats clambering up onto the furniture, but it was no use. For every rat she kicked away, another one appeared, until soon they were climbing their way up John's jeans, their sharp little claws digging into his flesh. The rats tore at Sally's clothes, climbing over one another desperately, heading towards her mouth, trying to burrow their way in. Hairy bodies filled her vision, and the stench of disease made her gag. Seizing an opportunity, a rat tried to clamber through her open jaws. She felt its tiny paws scrabbling at her tongue. With tears filling her eyes, she took one fleeting look at the man she loved and noticed something behind him.
A giant yellow bottle with the words "rat poison" stamped into the side was sitting precariously on top of their cabinet. Half stumbling, half swimming, Sally pushed her way through the throng of rats filling their apartment and desperately grabbed the bottle from on top of the cabinet. Throwing the rats off her hands, she managed to unscrew the lid, held the bottle high over her head, and poured the thick, stinking liquid all over the swarm of rats threatening to engulf her. The chorus of death filled the room. Whether it was the sound of the rats dying or their bodies being evaporated by the poison, she couldn't tell. All she could do was push through to try and find her husband and save him too. And miraculously, within just a few seconds, all of the rats had disappeared. The room was empty, the same as it had always been. Even the big yellow bottle was gone from her hand. All she could do was stare at John as he stared back at her, as the words, "Level 1, complete," appeared above their heads. Welcome to SCP-1315, the most visceral, most real, and most dangerous horror game you will ever have the misfortune of playing. It's not too late to back out at the menu screen when you select how many players you want. It's not even too late at the confirmation screen, but once you're in the game, there's no turning back. Either you beat the game, or you die trying. Beating this game is no easy feat. A copy of SCP-1315 has been in Foundation containment since 1986, but in all of that time, only one D-Class personnel has managed to make it to level 33. It is not known how many levels there are, but there is theoretically a final boss. The reason why no one has been able to beat it thus far is that with each level, the difficulty of the game increases. Relatively minor challenges in the first few levels give way to extremely difficult, life-threatening scenarios as the player progresses. These levels broadly follow the same pattern each time, but individual levels often contain an element of randomness. For example, level 1 that Sally and John played contained rats, but other tests have shown subjects being swarmed by insects and spiders, often coinciding with established phobias that the subject has reported prior to the experiment. 2 hours later, John and Sally were running low on ammo. With both couches pushed against the door to the lounge, they both hunkered down behind the TV, loading the remains of their shells into the shotguns. From out in the hallway, they could hear the heavy footsteps of more animals rushing towards them. When the pounding on their door had first started, they assumed it had been their neighbor coming up to complain about their screaming and running around in the previous levels. John had been so deep in thought trying to work out what their cover story could be, that when he opened the door and saw an adult grizzly bear standing on its hind legs in front of him, it had taken him almost too long to react. Sprinting back into the lounge, he found his wife already loading rounds into the shotgun that had suddenly appeared on the floor in front of her. With a grim expression on her face, she seemed to have accepted their new reality, that this was a game they were going to have to fight their way through. But with every bear they shot as it tried to push its way into their lounge, 2 more had appeared just minutes later. While they had been conservative with their ammo, aiming for the heads and not taking any risks, the pair was starting to run dangerously low. Was there an objective they were missing? Were they supposed to have done something to progress through the level? Sally mashed a couple buttons on the NES controller, and then some text appeared on the red screen. Objective: survive. 4 bears appeared in the doorway and pushed hard against the couch. It slid out of the way and they charged into the room. Sally and John desperately took down the first 2 of them, but the dreaded click of the triggers told them they had nothing left. Closing their eyes and bracing themselves for the worst, the pounding of heavy paws on their vinyl floor suddenly stopped. The bears had disappeared. Level 3 complete. Well, whatever's next can't be worse than that, surely. But it was. They managed to hold out in their apartment until level 9. But then the windows behind their heads smashed into 1,000 shards as a black-booted SWAT team swung into the room. With barely any time to react, Sally and John pushed their way out of the apartment and braced themselves down to their car. Slamming both doors closed, they took off racing towards the highway as the SWAT vehicles pursued them. 3 hours later, the couple was running low on gas. Swerving their way along the interstate, their eyes on the mirrors constantly, the pair was pretty certain they'd managed to lose their assailants.
Slowing their car to the speed limit, they gently weaved their way through the traffic towards the nearest gas station. Trying their best not to look suspicious, the two of them went inside, keen to stock up on supplies. Who knew how long this game would go on for? They had already been active for hours and were exhausted. With the SWAT team hopefully long behind them now, the adrenaline rush was starting to wear off, and the reality of this situation was starting to set in. Hopefully, there were just 10 levels and they only had one to go. With the sinking feeling in their chests, each one of them realized it was more than likely to be 100. Definitely time to stock up on some supplies. They were barely halfway around the gas station when the words, "Level 9, complete," flashed in the sky above them. Both John and Sally froze where they were and stared at each other over the aisles. A blue flash darted past them outside the windows, then again going the other way. Sally ran over to the counter and banged on the glass.
Lock the door! Lock the door!
But the teenager just looked at her in confusion. And now it was Sally's turn to look around and see her husband staring in horror. On the other side of the glass, standing between two gas pumps, was Sonic.EXE. With haunting red eyes, rows and rows of sharp teeth, and blood dripping from his mouth, the hedgehog stared intently. Sally pointed out the window and turned to the teenager, yelling, but the girl took a step back, looking scared of her. The girl couldn't see it. She couldn't see Sonic. For all these challenges, all the things they'd been fighting, was it just in her head? But there was no time to worry about that. Sally ran towards the door to the back of the shop. Hearing the footsteps of her husband running after her, she kicked open the fire exit but froze immediately. Sonic.EXE was standing there in front of her, smiling. It was toying with them. They needed to run to get out of here as quickly as possible, but how could they outrun Sonic? "Hey, Sonic!" John yelled from behind her. "You hungry?" He pushed Sally out of the way and threw a handful of chili dogs out into the forest. Hearing hungry, Sonic spun around and chased after his favorite food as quickly as possible. That had only bought them a few moments of time, but maybe that was all that they would get. Sally and John ran back through the convenience store and out the front. They couldn't run, but they could at least try to hide. A semi-truck had to slam on the brakes as the pair of them ran across the interstate. Without a choice of running anywhere else, all they could do was dart into the woods on the other side and hope that Sonic had a bad sense of smell. But as they ran through the woods, they could hear an ominous voice echoing behind them.
Gotta go fast. Gotta go faster than that.
Sally found a tree and dived into cover just at the right moment. Her husband wasn't so lucky. There was a flash of blue and a horrible crunching sound before his body hit the ground. Sonic.EXE was on top of him in a heartbeat, rows of sharp teeth gnashing. Sally clasped both hands over her face, trying desperately to block out the smell and trap her nervous breathing. She couldn't bring herself to look. Every bone in her body wanted to take off running through the forest, out onto the road to try and find some help. But there was nothing she could do. She could never outrun that thing. It was too fast, too savage. Even if she could convince someone on the highway to pull over and help her, they would just tell her she was going crazy. Maybe she was. Then the smell of her husband's body drifted over to her on the wind as the crunching sound of inhuman jaws filled her ears. New tears flowed. Then, silence. She couldn't hear anything, not even a whisper in the trees. Had she done it? Had she survived? Then a red sneaker stepped out from behind the tree, and Sally stared into the eyes of the blood-splattered, deranged hedgehog. Sally blinked, and it was gone. Level 10, complete. The open forest stretched out in front of her. Without a moment to catch her breath, Sally took off running into the country on her own. Whatever was coming next, she had to be ready for it. All small towns have their horror stories. Tales of places plagued by terrifying apparitions, unseen forces, and something waiting in the shadows to terrorize unsuspecting innocents. Sometimes it's a bridge at the edge of town, where a man in a bunny suit stalks, wielding an axe and looking for drivers who wander off of the main road. Sometimes it's a cabin in the woods rumored to house an old gnarled witch who steals people away and throws them into a giant soup pot. Maybe it's a cursed hotel where wicked spirits roam the halls and the guests check in but never check out. Or maybe, like the little town where 16-year-old Mark lived, it's a haunted house,
Ever since he was a little boy, Mark had been terrified of the house at the end of the lane. He walked past it on his way to school each morning and on his way back in the late afternoon. The sight of it made his palms sweat, his heart beat just a little bit faster. It had once been a grand Victorian manor, with turrets and a wraparound porch painted a brilliant white. But over the years, the paint had faded to a dingy yellow, peeling away from the rotting wood. There were holes in the roof where the rain and snow dripped through between the shingles. The windows were caked with dust and grime, obscuring anything that might be hiding inside. Not that there should have been anything there. The house had been abandoned for decades. Still, whenever he passed it, Mark could swear he felt the presence of something in there, pacing, watching, waiting for him to come inside. The stories around town didn't help. His parents told him to ignore them, said that people just liked to talk when there was nothing else to do, to make up things to be afraid of, because their lives were too boring otherwise. But he couldn't avoid it. On a Boy Scouts trip when he was 12, Mark had tried to cover his ears when the other boys gathered around the campfire with him, and turned the topic to the old house, but they teased and taunted him until he listened. They leaned in, faces lit ghoulishly from below by the flickering orange flames, and whispered about the ghost that had taken up residence inside the house. A wealthy old woman had lived there a long, long time ago, they said. She was cruel, with a nasty temper. Everyone in town knew to avoid her, knowing she would throw things at them from her window, shout at them, even sick her guard dogs on them. But one group of boys in town couldn't resist giving her a good scare. They dressed up in all black, red devil masks covering their faces, and broke into her house late one night. When she awoke, they were standing at the foot of her bed, holding pitchforks and telling her that they had come to drag her to hell. Her heart stopped from pure terror at the sight. But her spirit lingered in the house, swearing revenge against anyone who ever dared cross her threshold again, especially teenage boys. Mark didn't sleep a wink the whole camping trip after hearing that. He swore then and there that no matter what, he would never go into that house. But everyone can be bought, and everyone has a price. For Mark, that price was a car. He had been saving up as best he could, but it was tough to get a job with no way to transport himself there, and mowing lawns for his neighbors wasn't the most lucrative gig. So when he learned that his neighbor Oliver, home on a break from college, was getting rid of his old car, he begged to buy it. He doubted Oliver would go for it, knowing what a jerk the guy could be, but to Mark's surprise, Oliver gave him an offer. "I'll tell you what," Oliver's face broke into a sadistic smile. "I'll give you the car if you can spend the whole night in the house at the end of the street, alone." "Are you serious?" Mark scoffed. "Dead serious. Make it to sunrise without freaking out and bailing, and the car's yours. We have a deal?" Oliver stuck out his hand to shake. Every nerve in Mark's body was screaming at him to say no, but if he didn't agree, he wouldn't be able to afford a car until he was in college. With a defeated sigh, he took Oliver's hand. "Deal." But as night fell and Mark prepared to meet Oliver outside of the derelict old house, he could feel pangs of regret deep in his stomach. What was he thinking? Was a car really worth living his worst nightmare? What if Oliver didn't honor the deal? Or worse, what if the stories were actually true? He swallowed the lump in his throat as he shoved a sandwich into his backpack. He had food, water, a blanket, a flashlight, and his phone. Everything he should need to survive the night. It would be fine, he hoped. "Wasn't sure if you'd show," Oliver smirked as Mark walked up to meet him on the rickety front porch. "Well, I did. I'm here." Mark fidgeted nervously, staring up at the house, its windows gazing down at him like large, dark eyes. "So here are the rules. You have to stay here until sunrise. You leave before then, the deal's off. No car for you. And you have to stay alone. No calling for help from your little friends or your mommy and daddy. I'll be back to check on you in the morning and make sure you really did it. Got it?" "Got it," Mark nodded. "Good luck." "I'm rooting for you." "Really?" Oliver turned to leave, then glanced over his shoulder for one final dig. "Oh, and watch out for the ghost. I heard if she gets you, there won't even be bones left over. Night!" And with that, he walked away. Mark stared down at the doorknob, preparing himself to walk inside. He could still leave. He could turn and run all the way back home, but then Oliver would be right, and he would be a coward. No, he was going to do it. He wasn't some scared little kid anymore. It was just a big, empty house, nothing more. He slowly turned the doorknob, pushed, and with a long, low creak, the door opened to the darkness within. Against his better judgment, Mark instinctively called out, "Hello?" There was, thankfully, no response, just his voice echoing in the vast, empty room. He let out a small sigh of relief and pulled the flashlight out of his backpack, switching it on. He cast its beam around the front room of the house, illuminating water damage, cobwebs that he could only hope were no longer housing any spiders, and a whole lot of plastic-wrapped furniture. As he walked into the living room, he was struck by just how ordinary it all seemed. It was creepy, of course, like any place made for a living that had been deprived of its purpose for far too long, but it wasn't nearly as bad as his imagination had built it up to be. He had been picturing black candles, symbols drawn on the floor in blood, a skeleton perched on the couch, bats hanging from the ceiling. But there was none of that. No ghosts, no signs of danger. This was just mostly sort of sad. Once a home, now just a house, emptied out and left to decay. He could get through the night just fine. As soon as he thought that, he felt something scurry across his foot and let out a scream. The flashlight revealed it to be a large rat running from his sudden intrusion and looking for a place to hide. He clutched his chest, catching his breath. It's just an animal. It's fine. It's not going to hurt you, he reminded himself. Now that some of the mystery was gone, he was starting to wonder what the rest of the house looked like. What had once been breathless fear was replaced with a certain morbid curiosity. If he had to be here all night, he might as well explore. Hey, he thought to himself with a smile. Exposure therapy really works. Scared of a haunted house? Just go roaming around inside the middle of the night. You'll be cured. He sat his backpack down next to the stairs, keeping a grip on his flashlight, and began to investigate the rest of his greatest childhood fear. He walked through the dining room, taking in the ornate chandelier hanging from the ceiling, the long table fit for housing at least a dozen guests. He wandered into the kitchen, the appliances rusty from neglect. The oven and stove where someone once prepared their nightly dinners, all the pieces of life strewn about like an unfinished jigsaw puzzle with no one to pick up the pieces. Suddenly, Mark heard something coming from the other room. It couldn't be, but it sounded like footsteps on the stairs. Someone or something walking down, descending the staircase toward him. He held his breath, heart pounding so hard he couldn't hear it in his ears. The footsteps stopped, and the house was silent once again. Then, slowly, deliberately, he heard the same footsteps heading back up until they faded away, too quiet to hear anymore. That wasn't his imagination. He was not alone in the house. Carefully, he tiptoed back the way he came, careful to not make too much noise walking across the creaking floorboards. When he reached the stairs, he saw no signs of anyone else. In fact, there was nothing there at all. Wait, where was his backpack? He scanned the floor, certain he had just overlooked it, forgetting where he sat it down, but no matter where he looked, it wasn't there. His stomach dropped with a sudden realization. Whoever he had heard coming down the stairs must have taken it. He thought briefly about abandoning it and just running out the front door and never looking back, but his phone was in there. If his parents found out, he'd be grounded for months. Not to mention, he wouldn't have a phone. But what if whoever took it was dangerous? He couldn't be sure, but something in his gut told him he needed to go upstairs and check it out. He considered the weight of the flashlight in his hand. If someone attacked him, would it be enough to defend himself? He sure hoped so. With shaky hands and unsteady legs, he began to climb the stairs to the second floor of the house. Maybe whoever had taken his backpack was just as scared of him as he was of them. It was a comforting thought, though the comfort was short-lived. As he started down the upstairs hall, preparing to search the first bedroom, he heard a door creak open behind him. He turned and froze in wide-eyed terror at the sight. There was a figure there, emerging from the shadows. A pale woman with long, dark hair wearing a white nightgown, reaching out to him with a clawed hand. "Get out!" a voice rasped. Mark shrieked, dropped the flashlight, and tore back down the stairs. He ran to the front door, but as his hand touched the doorknob, a hand grabbed his ankle and pulled. He toppled over, landing on the ground with a painful thud. "Please," he sobbed, shaking from fear. "Don't hurt me. I'll leave. I'm so sorry. Don't kill me." He braced himself for an unearthly voice, for pain, but instead he heard gleeful cackling. He opened his eyes and saw Oliver standing above him. "I knew you couldn't do it. You're such a chicken," he smirked. "What?" Mark stammered.
Come on, did you really think I was gonna give you my car? Are you stupid? Oliver scoffed. Clearly. Mark followed the sound of the new voice coming down the stairs. There was Chase, one of Oliver's equally awful friends. He still believes in haunted houses. Did you like my work? I made myself. He held up what Mark could now see was a prop, a mannequin dressed up like some kind of ghostly woman. You gave it a good try, but I think it's time for you to run along home now, Oliver sneered. Yeah, run home. Ugh. Chase's taunt was cut off as he fell against the banister suddenly. What the hell? Who pushed me? He whirled around, but there was no one on the stairs with him. Still, Mark could hear the sound of footsteps hammering past Chase and toward him and Oliver. What happened next shocked him to his core. Oliver was dragged to his feet by the collar of his shirt, pulled by an unseen force. Then, with a loud thwack, something invisible hit him square in the nose. Ow! He cried out, but before he could react anymore, he was dealt another blow to the stomach, doubling over in pain. What the? Something swept his legs out from under him and he fell hard, head hitting the floor with a crack. Then, it was quiet. Oliver was still breathing, but very much unconscious, blood trickling from his nose. Screw this! Chase yelled, bolting out the door. As Mark scrambled toward the door to follow him to run home before he could be attacked next, he saw his backpack sliding across the floor toward him. Thanks for the sandwich, a female voice said, though he couldn't see the source. I love peanut butter. You're welcome, he stammered before grabbing his bag and sprinting all the way home. As the story of the haunted house began to spread, rumors and local news reports alike reached the ears of the SCP Foundation. Foundation staff in the area placed infrared cameras around the abandoned house, and the footage captured a human heat signature. Whatever was in that house, it was no ghost. Using infrared cameras to track the entity, it was quickly brought into custody. Before long, the entity was opening up to the Foundation, and she offered to cooperate willingly in exchange for warm food and shelter. So the invisible woman was taken to a nearby Foundation site and given the official classification SCP-347. SCP-347 is a young adult woman, standing at approximately 164 centimeters tall. For all intents and purposes, she is a completely average woman, with one exception. She is completely invisible to the naked eye. This includes her body, as well as everything inside of it, including her blood, skin, and hair samples. Though the cones and rods of the human eye must be visible in order to see, SCP-347's vision has registered as normal following extensive tests. She refers to herself with the name Claudia, though this is assumed to be an alias inspired by Claudia Rains, the lead actor in The Invisible Man. Her real identity, if she indeed has one, has not yet been confirmed. Aside from her invisibility, SCP-347's only other notable traits are an ability to pick locks, a talent for thievery, and the ability to swallow small objects in order to turn them invisible, and then cough them up at a later time without any sickness or discomfort. She seems to crave human contact and socialization, becoming frustrated when she is ignored. She will act out in these cases by pranking people and rearranging and hiding their things. When she is left alone with someone who is sleeping, she has been known to stroke their hair, touch their face, or tuck them in. She does this, she says, because it just feels right. However, those it is done to tend to describe the behavior as unnerving. Though she is invisible in terms of visible light, she can still be seen using infrared or ultraviolet cameras. SCP-347 is currently contained at Site 1, kept in a 5-meter by 5-meter room monitored with an infrared camera. The room has an attached bathroom complete with a shower and bathtub, a queen-size bed, 2 armchairs, a desk and a swivel chair, several bookcases, a TV, and a DVD player. Her bookcases are filled with books, mainly adventure stories, romance novels, and art books, as per her request. She has also been permitted DVD copies of any movies or television shows that she asks for, as long as they predate her arrival at the SCP Foundation. New releases may be added, but only after prior approval from the research team. Though she does not frequently wear clothes, she is to be provided with any clothing that she requests, as well as a collection of makeup and wigs. She has been encouraged to dress up to her heart's content, as it allows Foundation staff to more easily gauge her location at any given time. While she is inside, the door to her room must remain locked. At least 2 staff members must check her door every hour for signs of tampering with the lock. The door may only be unlocked to allow staff in and out for interviews, research, and the delivery of meals and other requested items. She thoroughly enjoys human company, and will chat, joke, and even flirt with those who visit her room. She is permitted to leave her containment if and only if she is accompanied by a staff member with at least level 2 security clearance, as well as wearing a layer of grease paint on her face and gloves on her hands. This allows the staff to see her hands and facial expressions. While she is out and about, staff are instructed to treat her with respect and avoid making any rude or crass comments about her invisibility, or her state of dress or undress. If she attempts to escape, she is to be returned to her room and locked inside. If the staff are unable to detect SCP-347's location, they will be given infrared heat vision goggles and instructed to keep an eye out for unusual phenomenon. Dr. Wrights added an addendum to her official file, warning male personnel to politely decline any advances that SCP-347 makes towards them. His note reads, "She's an invisible kleptomaniac. When you leave afterward, you're gonna realize 3 seconds too late that you don't have your keys in your pocket anymore, and you will be held accountable for whatever happens. Besides, the last thing we need is an invisible pregnancy. Dr. Wrights." Yeesh. When she was first contained, SCP-347 had regular violent outbursts and displayed signs of emotional instability, including compulsive theft and depressive episodes during which she would give all surrounding people the silent treatment. Her condition has improved gradually over time, with the application of regular counseling sessions intended to help her heal from the trauma caused by years of complete isolation and being unseen by the world around her. Several of the research staff studying Claudia have suggested that she be introduced to other SCPs, particularly those who are humanoid and considered to be non-threatening. She might, they posit, benefit from social interaction with other anomalous beings that she can relate and connect to. This, in addition to her therapy, could improve her mental and emotional state significantly. After all, just because she's invisible, that doesn't mean she has to feel invisible too. Claudia has expressed a great deal of interest in this idea, stating that it would be nice to have some friends on the inside who aren't being paid to talk to her. Though no matchups have been approved as of yet, several anomalies have been proposed should the program be put into action. SCP-507 was brought up in conversation by more than one researcher, given his harmless nature, friendly demeanor, and fascination with the paranormal. He supported the idea enthusiastically, stating that he would be thrilled to meet a real-life invisible person. SCP-343 has also asked to meet with Claudia, believing he can potentially help her overcome some of her emotional difficulties and offer her some much-needed comfort. Other potential anomalies to introduce to Claudia include SCP-073 and SCP-056, though Claudia's flirtatious nature might complicate the latter. Everybody wants to be known, to be acknowledged, and recognized for the person that they know themselves to be. For SCP-347, it once seemed as if having that simple desire, that human need met, would be impossible for her. But now, for better or for worse, as long as she's in the custody of the SCP Foundation, Claudia can make something approximating a normal life. She can, at last, be seen. Now go check out SCP-811 Swamp Woman and SCP-953 Polymorphic Humanoid for even more lovely and not so lovely anomalous ladies.